The photographer raised his hand, counting down from 3, and my sister used the distraction to remove me from the family. Sloane clamped her fingers just above my elbow, her French manicure digging through the wool of my blazer, and steered me out of the frame. She did not look at me. She smiled for the lens and told the guests I was stepping aside to check on the caterers. I let her guide me toward the edge of the alcove. I did not pull away, did not argue, did not give the ballroom the spectacle they were waiting for. Sloane released my arm the moment we were out of the camera's view. Then, to make sure the wealthiest woman in the room understood my exact place in the hierarchy, my parents joined in. My mother, Victoria, smoothed her silk dress and gestured toward me with a sigh. "We do not mention Genevieve's career much, Evelyn. She is our little failure. She works with her hands." My father, Richard, adjusted his lapel and offered a tight, apologetic laugh to the billionaire standing before us. A detour from the academic track, but we love her regardless. What none of them knew, not my sister measuring the centerpieces, not my parents tallying the social capital of this engagement, was that the woman they were trying to impress was not looking at their tailored suits. Evelyn Bradford was looking at my hands. She stared at the pale stain of methyl cellulose on my left thumb and the raised callus on my index finger. The room went quiet. Evelyn stepped closer to me, ignoring my family entirely, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "So it is you," she said, letting the words hang in the cold air. "This changes everything." Then she turned and walked out of the ballroom. "Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where we sit with the women, everyone underestimated, and watch what happens when the truth finally gets a chair at the table." If a story ever makes you feel a little less alone, that is the whole point. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe so the next one finds you. My name is Genevieve Alden. I drove to my sister's engagement party with the faint smell of binding glue still on my cuffs. I am 26 years old, and I work in the basement of a historical society restoring 18th century manuscripts. In Boston, old money speaks a specific language. It operates on academic prestige, Ivy League faculty passes, and the generational assumption that intellectual status is the only currency that matters. In the Alden household, working with your hands is a moral failing. My father measures worth by board seats. My mother measures it by the names on a guest list. Because I chose to preserve history rather than teach it from a lecture hall that math was settled before I left college. The engagement party was held at the Somerset Club in Beacon Hill, a venue my parents could no longer afford but booked anyway to maintain the illusion. The room smelled of rented orchids and quiet desperation. Sloane was marrying Preston Bradford, a merger designed to save my family from the financial ruin they hid behind tailored coats and summer homes. The Bradfords owned shipping lines and real estate holding companies. The Aldens owned a name that was rapidly running out of credit. I stood by the dessert station with a glass of club soda and watched the panic ripple through my family the second Evelyn Bradford walked away. My father froze, his hand still hovering over a tray of champagne flutes. My mother's polite smile faltered, her eyes darting around the room to see who had witnessed the matriarch's abrupt departure. Sloane turned on me, the delicate bride facade dissolving into the older sister I knew too well. "What did you do?" Sloane hissed, keeping her voice low so the string quartet would drown it out. "I stood where you put me," I said. My voice was level, the tone I use when handling a document that might crumble if I breathed too hard. "You embarrassed us." My mother stepped in, her tone sharp and precise. "You come here dressed like you just stepped out of a workshop and you insult Evelyn Bradford by—" She waved a hand toward me, unable to finish the thought. "By being you." I looked down at my clothes. I wore a tailored black blazer, clean trousers, and minimal jewelry. I did not look like a failure. I looked like a woman who paid for her own wardrobe instead of putting it on a credit card she could not cover. "Evelyn did not leave because of my blazer, Mom," I said. "She left because she read the room." My father stepped closer, his jaw tight. "You will not speak to your mother that way. We invited you tonight out of obligation, Genevieve. We asked you to stand quietly in the background. If you have jeopardized this wedding with whatever stunt you just pulled, I will see to it that you regret it." He meant it. Richard Alden never made idle threats when his reputation was on the line. But threats only work on people who have something left to lose. I had spent my entire life in the back row of this family, tasked with maintaining their equilibrium while they took the credit. I was the one who fixed the broken hinges on the antique cabinets they showed off to guests. I was the one who quietly transferred portions of my paycheck into their account every month, paying the property taxes on the house they claimed they owned outright. They called it rent for my childhood bedroom. They framed it as a favor, letting their wayward daughter stay under their roof while she played with old paper. I let them believe I was grateful. I let them believe I did not notice the past due notices arriving in the mail, or the way the landscaping service had stopped coming, or the fact that my father's prestigious consulting firm had not landed a new client in 3 years. I noticed all of it. A conservator's job is to see the decay that other people gloss over. You learn to spot the mold in the binding before it eats the pages. You learn to feel the weakness in the spine. My family's spine was snapping, and Sloane's marriage to Preston Bradford was the only tape holding it together. I did not pull a stunt, I told my father, setting my club soda on a passing waiter's tray. I just existed. If that is enough to jeopardize the wedding, perhaps the merger is not as stable as you thought. Sloane scoffed, a short, breathless sound. Preston loves me. Evelyn just needs time to understand our family dynamic. I will smooth it over tomorrow. You do that, I said. I picked up my clutch from the table. I have to be at the lab early anyway. There is a tear in a colonial charter that needs mending. Of course. My mother said, her voice dripping with the familiar practiced pity she had used on Evelyn minutes before. Run back to your glue and your dust. We have real problems to fix. I turned and walked toward the coat check. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that the glue and the dust were the only honest things left in our family. I just kept walking. The air outside the Somerset Club was sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of the Boston harbor. I pulled my coat tight and walked down the cobblestone street, my mind turning over Evelyn Bradford's words. So it is you. This changes everything. I did not know what she meant yet. I only knew that a billionaire did not look at a stranger's calloused hands with that kind of recognition unless she had seen the work those hands produced. I had spent the last 2 years restoring private collections under a strict non-disclosure agreement through the Historical Society, repairing documents for families who wanted to preserve their history without the public knowing it was decaying. I reached my car, a sensible sedan parked 3 blocks away, to avoid the valet fees my parents had insisted on paying. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at my hands in the glow of the dashboard lights. The methyl cellulose stain on my thumb caught the street lamp. It was a mark of the trade, a sign of someone who knew how to put broken things back together. My parents thought I was a failure because I mended what they broke. They thought my silence was submission. They did not understand that preservation requires patience. You do not tear a fragile document apart to see what is wrong with it. You observe the damage, you map the weak points, and you wait until you have the exact right tools to secure it. I had been mapping the weak points in the Alden family for years. When I turned the key in the ignition, my phone vibrated in my purse. It was an automated alert from my banking app. A scheduled transfer had just cleared. $1,200 moving from my checking account to the joint household account my mother managed. It was the rent money I paid to live in my childhood bedroom. The money she claimed went directly to the city for property taxes to keep the Alden estate afloat. I stared at the notification. Something about the timing, right after the lavish display of the rented ballroom and the desperate posturing in front of Evelyn Bradford, made the numbers look different. I put the car in gear and pulled out onto the quiet street. Tomorrow, I was going to pull the property tax records for the house. I was going to find out exactly what my mother was doing with the money I bled for, and I was going to stop being the foundation they stood on while they called me the dirt beneath their feet. The basement lab is a climate-controlled vault located 3 floors beneath the busy Boston streets. Down here, the air smells of ethanol-aged leather and the faint dry dust of the 18th century. I sat at my stainless steel workbench the morning after Sloane's engagement party, the neon lights humming a steady, predictable rhythm overhead. In front of me lay a letter dated 1714, written by a merchant whose ship had gone down off the coast of Nantucket. The paper was brittle yellowed by 3 centuries of careless handling and improper storage. I picked up my favorite tool. It is an antique bone folder carved from cattle bone worn perfectly smooth by generations of bookbinders. I applied steady, gentle pressure, running the rounded edge of the bone along a stubborn crease in the parchment. I did not force the paper. I coaxed the weakened fibers back into alignment, giving the document the structural integrity it needed to survive another 100 years. That bone folder is the exact opposite of my family. It is a tool designed to smooth out damage without drawing attention to itself. My family prefers to create the damage and then drape a velvet cloth over the wreckage. In the Alden household, we operate on a toxic ledger where intellectual prestige is the only recognized currency. We are a product of historic New England culture, the kind of coastal Massachusetts environment that scoffs at flashy sports cars but demands a pedigree. My grandfather was a dean at a prestigious university. My father, Richard, runs an educational consulting firm that caters to wealthy families trying to buy their way into the Ivy League. My mother, Victoria, sits on the boards of 3 different historical societies, though she has never once bothered to learn how the artifacts she oversees are actually preserved. In their world, a person's worth is measured by the letters after their name. When Sloane graduated with a master's degree in art history, she immediately leveraged the title to secure a position at a high-end Newbury Point gallery, rubbing elbows with venture capitalists and trust fund heirs. She played the game perfectly, turning her degree into a hunting license that eventually landed her Preston Bradford. I took a different path, and it cost me my seat at the table. After college, I turned down a doctoral program to accept a quiet, grueling apprenticeship in archival conservation. I wanted to learn the chemistry of paper degradation. I wanted to understand how to wash a manuscript in an alkaline bath to neutralize acidic ink. I chose to work with my hands. In modern Boston society, choosing manual labor over a doctorate is viewed as a bizarre rebellion. To my parents, it was a social tragedy. They quietly relegated me to the back rows of the family narrative. When friends asked about my career, my mother would offer a tight smile and say I was taking time to figure things out. They treated my highly specialized, deeply intellectual trade as if I were a mechanic changing oil in a driveway. Yet they had no problem extracting the fruits of that labor. The Alden family estate sits on a prime tree-lined street in a coastal suburb just north of the city. It is a sprawling colonial-era home with a slate roof, original hardwood floors, and a facade that screams generational stability. It is also falling apart. The slate tiles are sliding off the roof. The plumbing in the east wing groans every time a faucet is turned on. My father's consulting firm has not secured a new client in nearly 3 years, a fact he hides behind tailored suits and expensive lunches at the club. 2 years ago, when I finished my apprenticeship and secured my permanent position at the Historical Society, I planned to rent an apartment in Cambridge. My mother stopped me. She sat me down at the mahogany dining table and presented a carefully constructed narrative of maternal concern. She told me that the rental market was predatory and that a girl making a conservator's salary would drown in the city. She offered me my childhood bedroom. She framed it as an act of grace. The catch was a monthly payment of $1,200. She called it a contribution to the household, a way to teach me financial responsibility. She specifically stated that my contribution would cover the quarterly property taxes, ensuring the family estate remained secure while I saved money for my future. I knew it was not a favor. I knew the truth the moment she slid a coaster under her iced tea and avoided meeting my eyes. The Aldens were cash poor. They needed my steady blue-collar adjacent income to keep the town from putting a lien on the house. I agreed to the arrangement because, despite their snobbery, they were my family. I believed that family carried family. I set up the automatic bank transfer, moving my hard-earned money into their joint account on the 1st of every month. I lived in a room with faded wallpaper, kept my head down, and allowed them to extract my resources while they simultaneously treated me as an embarrassment. I finished smoothing the merchant's letter, placed it between 2 sheets of protective blotter paper, and slid it into the drying press. My shift was over. I washed my hands at the deep utility sink, watching the soapy water rinse away the dust of the 18th century, leaving only my calluses behind. Evelyn Bradford's voice echoed in the sterile quiet of the lab. "So it is you. This changes everything." I dried my hands and grabbed my coat. The drive back to the suburban estate was a dull gray commute through the afternoon traffic. The coastal fog had rolled in early, casting a heavy damp chill over the historic neighborhoods. I pulled my sensible sedan into the long sweeping driveway of the Alden home. Sloane's luxury SUV was absent, likely parked at the bridal boutique where she was spending the afternoon spending money we did not have. I walked through the heavy front door, the hinges protesting with a loud metallic squeal that my father always promised to oil, but never did. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and old wood. A large ornate silver tray sat on the antique credenza near the staircase, serving as the designated landing zone for the Daily Mail. Usually, I ignore the mail. It is an endless stream of charity solicitations, gallery invitations, and alumni magazines designed to feed my parents' egos. But today, the stack had been knocked over, spilling onto the polished wood of the credenza. I reached out to straighten the pile, my fingers brushing against the stiff, unforgiving paper of the envelopes. A bright pink slip of paper caught my eye, peeking out from underneath a catalog for expensive outdoor furniture. I pulled it free. It was a notice from the municipal tax assessor. It was not sealed in an envelope. It was a final open warning printed on abrasive neon paper designed to embarrass the recipient into action. The bold black letters at the top read, "Final Notice of Tax Delinquency." I stared at the document. My archival training demands that I verify facts, cross-reference dates, and trust the ink on the page over the story being told. I read the numbers listed on the notice. The town was threatening immediate action for unpaid property taxes spanning the last 4 consecutive quarters. The exact amount owed matched the exact sum I had been transferring into my mother's account over the past 2 years. I stood in the quiet foyer, the silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My rent payments had never gone to the municipal tax office. For 2 years, my mother had taken the money I earned from the job she despised, promised to use it to secure our home, and diverted it somewhere else entirely. The roof over my head was in imminent danger of being leveraged by the town, while my parents paraded around a luxury ballroom drinking champagne they could not afford. The foundation of the Alden house was not just cracking. It had already collapsed, and I was holding the final piece of evidence in my calloused hands. I carried the neon pink tax notice down the hall, my footsteps silent on the Persian runner. The kitchen of the Alden estate is a showroom of culinary pretense. It boasts professional-grade stainless steel appliances that have never seen a Thanksgiving turkey and a sprawling island of imported white granite. My mother stood at that island. She wore a cashmere sweater set holding a microfiber cloth, spraying citrus cleaner onto a surface that was already flawlessly clean. I placed the municipal notice flat on the granite right in the path of her cloth. Victoria stopped. She looked at the bright paper, then up at me, her expression registering a fleeting annoyance rather than panic. She did not snatch the document. She did not gasp. She simply moved her spray bottle a few inches to the left. "Where did my rent go, Mom?" I asked. My voice remained in the same flat, unhurried register I use when cataloging water damage on a manuscript. Victoria resumed wiping the granite in smooth, methodical circles. "Do not use that accusatory tone with me, Genevieve. You know very well how expensive the upkeep of this estate has become. The roof alone is a nightmare." "The town intends to put a lien on the house," I said, tapping the edge of the notice. 4 consecutive quarters of unpaid property taxes. The total matches my automatic transfers to the dollar. You told me my payment secured this roof." My mother paused her cleaning. She folded the microfiber cloth into perfect symmetrical squares. She avoided my eyes, choosing instead to inspect a non-existent smudge near the sink. "The house is fine," she said, her voice adopting the crisp, authoritative cadence she used for charity board meetings. "Your father is expecting a very large consulting contract to close next month. He will handle the arrears before the town takes any actual action. You are overreacting to a standard bureaucratic warning. If the money did not go to the town, where did it go?" Victoria sighed a sharp intake of breath, designed to communicate that I was being deeply unreasonable. She finally met my gaze. Her eyes were hard, calculating, entirely devoid of maternal warmth. Sloane needed the Boston Public Library, Victoria stated, as if naming a historical landmark answered every mathematical discrepancy. Preston's family expects a certain caliber of event. The Bradfords are accustomed to the highest echelon of Boston society. We could not host a rehearsal dinner at a mid-tier hotel, and the library required a non-refundable reservation deposit to secure the date. It was an emergency. I stood there in the pristine kitchen, running the calculations in my head. 24 months, $1,200 a month. Nearly $30,000 of my income generated by the blue-collar labor they openly mocked had been secretly siphoned to rent a room full of books so my sister could pretend to read them. You used my rent to pay for Sloane's wedding venue, I said, ensuring the truth hung in the air without any protective, polite varnish. I used family resources to secure a family future, my mother corrected, returning to her rigorous wiping of the flawless stone counter. Sloane is marrying a Bradford. Do you understand what that means for us? This wedding saves us all. It opens doors your father desperately needs. It elevates our standing. Family carries family, Genevieve. I watched the rhythmic motion of her hand. That small telling action illustrated everything I needed to know about Victoria Alden. She was obsessed with polishing the surface while the foundation rotted underneath. She would rather present a spotless granite countertop to a guest than admit the pipes below were leaking. She looked at me expecting the usual compliance. She expected the daughter who fixed broken hinges and paid bills in the shadows to lower her head and accept the ledger. In her mind, the equation was perfectly balanced. Sloane provided the glamorous optics. I provided the invisible utility. I was not a daughter to them. I was a checking account. I was an asset to be quietly liquidated whenever the golden child required a brighter spotlight. My archival training teaches a fundamental rule regarding restoration. You cannot save a document that is currently being destroyed by its own environment. If a manuscript is resting in a highly acidic folder, no amount of careful mending will stop the decay. You must remove the paper from the corrosive box before you can salvage the history. My family was a corrosive box. I had spent my entire life setting myself on fire just to keep their illusions warm, believing that my utility might eventually earn their respect. But utility does not earn respect. It only earns a higher quota. You are right, I said, picking up the pink tax notice. Family does carry family, but you are going to have to find another pack mule. Victoria scoffed, tossing the folded cloth onto the island. Do not be dramatic. Where else are you going to go? You cannot afford a decent apartment in the city on your salary. That is no longer your concern, I replied. I turned my back on the immaculate kitchen and walked up the main staircase to my childhood bedroom. The space still held the faded floral wallpaper from my teenage years, a room preserved not out of nostalgia, but out of neglect. I did not waste time mourning the illusion of a home I never truly had. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet and began packing. I moved with clinical precision. I folded my tailored work clothes, my jeans, and the thick sweaters I wore in the climate-controlled basement of the Historical Society. I gathered my personal documents, my passport, and my specialized conservation tools, wrapping the antique bone folder in a soft flannel cloth. I left behind the expensive dresses my mother had forced me to buy for social events, taking only what I had purchased with my own wages. It took less than 40 minutes to dismantle 26 years of residence. When I carried my bags back down the stairs, the house was silent. My father was presumably still at his club, maintaining the facade of a busy consultant. My mother had retreated to her home office, likely drafting invitation lists for the wedding I had unknowingly funded. Neither of them came out to the hallway to watch me leave. I opened the heavy front door, stepping out into the damp coastal evening air. The fog had thickened, settling over the manicured lawns and the slipping slate roofs of the historic neighborhood. I walked down the driveway to my sensible sedan, unlocked the trunk, and placed my duffel bag inside. I pulled out my phone and disabled the automatic bank transfer I had set up 2 years prior. With a single tap on the screen, I severed their access to my labor. The financial pipeline was officially closed. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine humming quietly beneath me, and dialed the number of my closest friend, a fellow archivist who lived in a cramped but honest apartment in Somerville. She answered on the second ring, offering her couch before I even finished explaining the situation. I put the car in gear and drove away from the Alden estate without checking the rearview mirror. I did not shed a tear. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of a woman who had finally read the fine print of her own life. The theft of my wages was a deep betrayal, but it was also a liberation. They had shown me the exact price of my place in their world, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I drove into the city, preparing for an uncomfortable night on a borrowed sofa. I assumed the worst of the conflict was behind me, believing my sudden departure would force my parents to face their own financial ruin alone. I did not realize that a family accustomed to stealing your wages will eventually decide they own your professional credibility as well. I woke up on a lumpy beige sofa in Somerville, staring at a water stain on the ceiling of a cramped apartment. My neck ached. My back was stiff. And for the first time in 2 years, I woke up without a financial burden that did not belong to me resting on my shoulders. I was staying with Maya, a fellow archivist, who shared my deep respect for honest labor. Her apartment was tiny, cluttered with books and mismatched furniture, but it was authentic. It lacked the crushing performative weight of the Alden estate. I folded the borrowed blanket, drank a cup of bitter instant coffee from a chipped mug, and took the Red Line train into the city. I felt a strange, buoyant sense of clarity. Cutting off the financial pipeline to my parents had been a severe step, but it was necessary. I assumed they would spend the week scrambling to cover the property taxes, too preoccupied with their own created crisis to bother me. I was wrong. When you stop acting as a shock absorber for a toxic system, the system does not self-reflect, it escalates. The basement of the Historical Society is my sanctuary. It operates under strict, unyielding environmental controls. The temperature is locked at a constant 68 degrees. The humidity hovers precisely at 45%. The lighting is heavily filtered to prevent ultraviolet degradation. I spent the morning working on a fragile ledger from a prominent colonial mercantile family. The pages were brittle, suffering from iron gall ink corrosion. It is a fascinating, devastating chemical process, where the historic ink slowly eats through the paper it is written on. It is a quiet destruction. You do not notice the damage until the page literally shatters in your hands. My family operated on the exact same principle. They presented a beautiful, legible surface to the world, while the corrosive elements slowly dissolved the foundation from the inside out. I was leaning over my stainless steel workbench, using a micro spatula to apply a localized consolidant to a flaking signature when the heavy steel door to the conservation lab opened without a knock. The climate control system hummed in immediate protest as a rush of warm, unfiltered hallway air invaded the room. I looked up from my magnifying lamp, setting my tool down on the clean surface. Sloane walked in wearing a tailored ivory trench coat, the heels of her designer boots clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She brought the frantic, chaotic noise of the surface world directly into my sterile vault. Trailing just behind her was Preston Bradford, dressed in the effortless layered cashmere uniform of old Boston money. Behind them both was a third man carrying a professional camera rig equipped with a large external flash. Sloane did not look at me as a sister. She looked at me as a prop. She gestured around my carefully ordered workspace as if she were unveiling a new wing of an art gallery that she personally owned. "And this is the Restoration Vault," she announced, her voice adopting a breathless, practiced philanthropy. "It is one of the specialized preservation initiatives I oversee through the gallery's historical outreach program. We find it crucial to fund the restoration of Boston's founding documents. We even sponsor local artisans to do the manual labor, ensuring the trades stay alive in the modern era." I sat very still on my drafting stool. Sloane did not fund this lab. The high-end art gallery she worked for had zero affiliation with this historical society. My position was funded by a federal endowment that I had earned through a rigorous, highly competitive academic vetting process. But to Sloane, my life was merely raw material for her public relations campaign. She was actively painting my highly specialized career as a charity project she managed, attempting to turn my workspace into a philanthropic backdrop to impress her billionaire fiancé. Sloane looked at me, her smile bright and rigid, carrying a silent command. Genevieve, darling, be a dear and step to the side. We are doing a quick philanthropic spotlight for the wedding announcement feature in the Boston Globe. Just a few shots of Preston and me examining the sponsored artifacts. She expected me to nod, shrink into the shadows, and let her claim my professional credibility. She expected the girl who paid her mother's property taxes to quietly accept her role as a background extra. The man with the camera stepped forward, raising the heavy lens toward the colonial mercantile ledger resting on my workbench. His finger hovered over the shutter button. The external flash charged with a high-pitched mechanical whine. "Put the camera down," I said. I did not yell. I used the load-bearing, unyielding voice I reserve for emergency preservation protocols. It is a clinical tone that leaves no room for negotiation or debate. The photographer hesitated, lowering the lens slightly and looking between me and Sloane. "The documents in this room are highly photosensitive." I continued, standing up and calmly placing a sheet of protective acid-free opaque paper over the fragile ledger. "A direct burst of xenon flash photography will cause irreversible photochemical degradation to the 18th century ink. You are risking permanent historical loss. Step away from the bench." Sloane's rigid smile tightened into a grimace. A faint flush of anger crept up her neck. "Genevieve, do not be difficult. It is just a quick photograph. I authorized this project and I am authorizing the feature." I did not break eye contact with the photographer. "You do not authorize anything in a federal facility," I replied, my tone remaining entirely detached. "This is a restricted conservation lab. Photography of unsecured artifacts is a strict violation of institutional policy. I need you to take the camera out into the hallway right now." The photographer recognized authority when he heard it. He lowered his equipment and took a swift step back toward the heavy steel door, eager to remove himself from the escalating tension. Preston Bradford cleared his throat, attempting to smooth over the sudden sharp friction in the room. He stepped closer to the bench, looking at the protective opaque paper I had draped over the artifact. "My apologies, Genevieve. We certainly do not want to cause any damage to such vital pieces of history. Sloane was just telling me about this particular project on the drive over. The 19th century trade records are fascinating." Sloane seized the lifeline, eager to reassert her intellectual dominance in front of the Bradford heir. "Yes, exactly," she chimed in, stepping closer to Preston and resting a proprietary hand on his cashmere sleeve. "The industrial-era trade routes are a particular passion of mine. Securing these 19th century ledgers ensures we remember the industrial boom that built the foundation of this city." I looked at my sister. Her art history degree had taught her how to mingle at gallery openings, but it had not taught her how to read a date. "It is a mercantile log from 1714, I said. My voice was soft, stripping away the polite fiction without an ounce of malice. "That places it in the early 18th century, nearly 100 years before the industrial era you are referencing. It deals with maritime bartering, not industrial trade." The silence that followed was suffocating. Preston Bradford, a man raised in a family that prided itself on authentic historical knowledge rather than performative intellect, paused. He looked at Sloane, his expression registering a faint, unmistakable flicker of disappointment. It was the look of a man realizing the expert guide he hired was reading from the wrong brochure. Sloane's hand dropped from his arm. Her face paled. She had brought her billionaire fiancé down into my basement to show him a charity case, and instead, I had casually dismantled her intellectual facade in 2 sentences. "I need to return to my work," I said, breaking the silence and sitting back down at the stainless steel bench. "The door will lock automatically behind you." Preston nodded politely, offering a brief apology before guiding the confused photographer out into the hallway. Sloane lingered behind for a fraction of a second. She leaned across the edge of the workbench. The glamorous bride vanished, replaced by the cornered, desperate woman underneath. "I will ruin you for this," Sloane hissed, her voice a toxic whisper meant only for my ears. "I am going to call the Historical Society director this afternoon. I will tell them you are unhinged. I will make sure you are fired by Friday for embarrassing this family." I did not look up from the protective paper covering the fragile manuscript. I picked up my bone folder, finding the familiar smooth groove of the handle. "Close the door on your way out, Sloane. You are letting in the humidity." The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing the lab in its quiet, climate-controlled perfection once more. The morning after Sloane threatened my job, I expected a swift reprimand from the Historical Society director. I prepared a clinical defense. I gathered the facility security logs demonstrating my sister had breached a restricted climate zone without authorization. I braced myself to fight for my career. I did not expect the director's assistant to walk into my lab carrying a heavy vellum envelope embossed with a discreet naval crest. The card inside contained 2 sentences written in dark fountain pen ink. "A car is waiting at the service entrance. Evelyn Bradford expects you at 11. I changed out of my protective smock, washed the chemical residue from my hands, and walked upstairs. A sleek black town car sat idling by the loading dock. The driver opened the rear door without speaking. I slid into the leather interior, my mind turning over every possible variation of the incoming negotiation. When a billionaire summons the sister of her son's future bride, the agenda is rarely complicated. I assumed Evelyn had heard about the friction at the Historical Society. I assumed she wanted to protect the pristine optics of the upcoming high society wedding. She was going to offer me a quiet, dignified sum of money to decline my invitation and stay far away from the cameras. I decided during the smooth ride across the city that I would reject the money. I did not want their wealth. I only wanted my own peace. The Bradford corporate headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a monolithic tower in the financial district. The lobby bypassed the ostentatious marble typical of new money. It favored dark walnut brushed steel and the kind of hushed acoustics that swallow noise instantly. An executive assistant met me at the elevator bank and guided me up to the top floor. Evelyn Bradford's office overlooked the gray waters of the Boston Harbor. She stood by a long mahogany conference table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. She did not offer a polite smile or a meaningless pleasantry about the morning fog. She waited for the heavy wooden door to click shut behind me. "Take a seat, Genevieve," Evelyn said, gesturing to a leather chair across the table. I sat down, keeping my posture straight and my hands folded in my lap. I braced myself for the checkbook. I waited for her to state her price. Evelyn did not reach for a pen. She reached for the edge of a black velvet cloth draped over a large rectangular object resting on the center of the table. She pulled the fabric back, revealing a custom climate-controlled display case. Inside the thick glass rested a sprawling piece of aged parchment. The breath caught in my throat. I recognized the document immediately. It was a 17th-century maritime charter granted by the English crown, establishing the original colonial shipping routes that built the foundation of the Bradford family empire. It was a priceless piece of history. It was also a document I had spent 6 grueling months intimately repairing. The Historical Society frequently takes on blind restoration contracts for private estates. The clients remain anonymous to protect their privacy, and the conservators remain anonymous to protect the institution. We receive the artifacts, we mend the damage, and we return them. I had worked on that specific charter just over a year ago. It had arrived suffering from severe fungal degradation along the lower margins and catastrophic tearing near the royal seal. "My son believes your sister is a suitable match because she can navigate a charity gala and speak conversational French," Evelyn said, keeping her eyes on the parchment. "Preston values the surface. He was raised in a generation that mistakes a polished veneer for structural integrity. I do not share his confusion." Evelyn walked around the table and stopped beside my chair. She leaned down, tapping a manicured fingernail against the display case, pointing toward the bottom left corner of the charter. "This section was dissolving into dust when we sent it to the society," Evelyn said. Her voice carried a quiet, intense reverence. "The previous conservator we hired suggested trimming the margin entirely. They claimed the paper was unsalvageable. You did not trim it." I looked at the corner she indicated. "Trimming a historical document is vandalism," I replied, my professional instincts overriding my caution. I used a localized application of gelatin sizing to reinforce the weakened fibers. Once the paper had enough tensile strength, I reattached the fragmented pieces using a specialized binding technique. Evelyn smiled. It was a genuine expression of deep respect. She tapped the glass again directly over the repaired seam. You used a whip stitch. You wove a silk thread finer than a human hair through the decaying parchment to anchor it to a backing board. The thread is entirely invisible to the naked eye. I had to use a jeweler's loop to find it. She stood up straight and crossed her arms. You spent hundreds of hours executing a microscopic repair that no one would ever see, simply because it was the correct way to ensure this charter survived another century. You possess a rare and valuable trait, Genevieve. You care about the foundation, not the audience. I sat in the leather chair processing the drastic shift in the atmosphere. The matriarch of the Bradford family had not summoned me to banish me from the wedding. She had summoned me because she recognized my competence. She respected the invisible labor my own family treated as a humiliating defect. I appreciate the compliment, Mrs. Bradford, I said carefully. But I doubt you brought me to the financial district just to discuss my silk threading technique. Evelyn walked back to her desk. I brought you here because I have spent the last 3 weeks watching your parents scramble. Richard Alden cornered 2 of my board members at a charity function last Tuesday. He attempted to solicit a consulting contract with an aggressive desperation that frankly embarrassed everyone in the room. Victoria has been charging wedding expenses to a credit line carrying an exorbitant interest rate. Evelyn leaned against the edge of her desk, locking her gaze onto mine. The Alden estate requires significant capital to maintain. The slate roof needs a total replacement. The property taxes in that municipality are punishing. I ran a quiet, preliminary financial review on your family prior to the engagement. Richard's firm is generating a fraction of its former revenue. Yet until a few days ago, their accounts remained artificially stable. Then a scheduled monthly deposit abruptly ceased, and the facade immediately began to crack. My stomach tightened. Evelyn Bradford did not just know about the tax delinquency. She knew about my departure. She possessed the resources to monitor the financial heartbeat of anyone who entered her orbit, and she had pinpointed the exact moment I severed my financial lifeline to my parents. You withdrew your capital, Evelyn stated, presenting it as a fact rather than a question. You stopped subsidizing their illusions. My financial arrangements with my parents are a private matter, I replied, keeping my voice level. Privacy is a luxury for people who can afford their bills, Evelyn countered smoothly. Your sister is a decorative ornament. Your parents are social climbers operating on borrowed time. They view this marriage as a rescue mission. They expect the Bradford wealth to quietly absorb their liabilities once the ink on the marriage certificate dries. Evelyn walked back to the conference table. She picked up a thick manila folder resting near the display case and held it in her hands. I built this empire by understanding the true value of an asset, Evelyn said. She spoke with the ruthless clarity of a woman who had spent decades dismantling her competitors. I know how to identify a bad investment, and I know how to recognize someone who knows how to mend what other people break. I do not care about Sloane's gallery job. I care about legacy. I care about competence, and you are the only member of your family who possesses any. She placed the manila folder on the table and slid it across the polished mahogany until it stopped inches from my hands. I want you to review this, Evelyn instructed. I looked down at the folder. The cover bore no label, but it carried a substantial weight. What is it? I asked. It is a detailed audit, Evelyn replied. I commissioned a deeper forensic review of the Alden financial history when I noticed the discrepancies in their current liquidity. I expected to find standard upper-class mismanagement. I expected unpaid country club dues and overextended equity lines. Evelyn stepped back, her expression hardening into something cold and formidable. I found something far worse. Your parents have not merely mismanaged their own funds, they have actively intercepted yours. I stared at the folder, the heavy paper mocking me. My mind raced through the possibilities. I already knew about the diverted rent money and the unpaid property taxes. I had confronted my mother about the wedding venue deposit. I believed I had unearthed the full extent of their betrayal. But Evelyn Bradford's posture indicated a violation far more structural than a few stolen rent checks. Open it, Genevieve, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a tone of quiet, commanding urgency. Look at what your sister is really marrying with. I flipped the cover of the manila folder open. The pages inside were bright white, printed on heavy stock smelling faintly of warm toner from a high-end laser printer. It was a stark contrast to the decaying acidic parchment I handled daily, but the contents were infinitely more destructive. The first page was a summary sheet drafted by Evelyn's forensic accounting team. I bypassed it, turning to the primary source documents underneath. My training dictates that you never rely on another person's summary of an artifact. You read the original text. You examine the raw data. The second page was a photocopy of a formal letterhead. I recognized the crest immediately. It belonged to the Alden Cabot Preservation Foundation. The breath stalled in my chest. The Alden Cabot Preservation Fellowship is the most coveted grant available to young historical conservators in the Northeast. It provides $150,000 in unrestricted funding for a 2-year independent research sabbatical. It is designed to allow emerging experts to step away from institutional basements and fund their own specialized restoration projects. For me, it represented an escape route. It was the key to leaving my parents' sphere of influence, building my own laboratory, and establishing my name in the global archival community without relying on their conditional charity. I had spent 6 months assembling my application last year. I drafted meticulous proposals, gathered peer recommendations, and submitted a portfolio of my most complex restorations. I poured every ounce of my ambition into that submission. In December, a thick cream envelope arrived at the Alden estate. My father had intercepted the mail that afternoon. He walked into the kitchen, his face arranged in a mask of somber, practiced sympathy, and handed me the letter. I opened it while standing next to the granite island. It was a rejection. The text was polite, brief, and devastating, stating that the board had chosen to proceed with other candidates. My father had placed a warm, consoling hand on my shoulder. He offered a gentle, patronizing sigh. He told me that academic grants were highly competitive and that not everyone was meant for the top tier of the preservation world. He assured me it was honorable enough to just keep mending things in the background. I had believed him. I internalized the rejection, accepting my role as the family failure, convinced that my best efforts were simply not adequate. I looked down at the photocopy in Evelyn Bradford's folder. The letter was dated November 12th of last year. It was addressed to Genevieve Alden. It was not a rejection. It was an award notification. The Board of Directors is thrilled to offer you the Alden Cabot Preservation Fellowship for your outstanding contributions to maritime document recovery. I stared at the black ink. I had won. I had earned the escape route. I turned to the next page. It was a scanned copy of the disbursement check from the foundation issued for the full amount of $150,000. The payee, however, was not Genevieve Alden. The check was made out to the Alden Cabot General Family Trust. I flipped to the third page, reviewing a series of internal foundation routing documents. The mechanics of the theft laid themselves bare with cold, undeniable precision. My father held a legacy seat on the foundation's board of directors, an honorary position passed down through the family line. He possessed access to the internal award decisions before the public notifications were mailed. Richard Alden had intercepted my acceptance letter. He then exploited an archaic, century-old loophole in the foundation's bylaws, which permitted grant funds awarded to a family member to be disbursed into a family-managed educational trust rather than an individual account. He established the trust, named himself the sole trustee, and legally rerouted my fellowship check into his own hands. The rejection letter he handed me in the kitchen had been a forgery drafted and printed on stolen letterhead to ensure I never went looking for the money I had rightfully won. I did not just extract my monthly wages. He systematically destroyed my future career trajectory to keep me tethered to his sinking ship. I turned the page, following the forensic accountant's highlighted trail to see where my future had gone. The ledger was detailed and ruthless. $50,000 was immediately transferred to a brokerage account to cover margin calls on my father's failing equity investments. $30,000 was routed to a travel agency to fund Sloane's 6-week European art history tour, a lavish vacation disguised as educational enrichment strategically planned to court Preston Bradford in Paris and Rome. Another 20,000 bled out into country club dues, ensuring my father could continue buying expensive lunches and maintaining the illusion of wealth. My independent research sabbatical had been liquidated to buy Sloane's designer luggage and my father's golf memberships. Evelyn Bradford stood by the window watching the harbor traffic, giving me the silence necessary to absorb the magnitude of the betrayal. She expected a reaction. She likely expected tears, outrage, or a physical collapse. I did not cry. When you uncover a catastrophic flaw in a historical manuscript, emotion is a liability. Anger causes your hands to tremble, and a trembling hand will slip with a scalpel and sever a page forever. You must separate your feelings from the artifact. You must become a procedural instrument. You analyze the damage, you document the evidence, and you prepare the structural remedy. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the camera application. I held the phone directly over the photocopy of the rooted check. I adjusted my grip, ensuring the lens was parallel to the paper to prevent any distortion of the text. My hands were perfectly steady. I tapped the screen, allowing the autofocus box to lock onto Richard Alden's cursive signature on the endorsement line. The digital shutter clicked in the quiet office. I turned the page. I photographed the fraudulent trust establishment forms. I photographed the ledger detailing Sloane's European travel expenses. I captured the metadata of my own ruin, creating a pristine digital chain of custody. My father was a master of spoken manipulation. He thrived in the gray areas of conversation, altering his tone and twisting his words to make reality fit his narrative. He relied on the fact that verbal abuse leaves no physical marks. He could always claim I misunderstood his intentions. He could not argue with routing numbers. He could not gaslight a bank endorsement stamp. I finished photographing the final page of the audit. I verified the clarity of each image in my photo gallery, ensuring the dates and account numbers were legible. I closed the manila folder, aligning its edges perfectly, before pushing it back across the mahogany table toward Evelyn. Evelyn turned away from the window. She looked at the closed folder, then at my calm, unbothered posture. A slow, sharp smile spread across her face. She recognized the transition. She knew she was no longer looking at a victimized daughter. She was looking at an auditor preparing to serve an invoice. "Your father believes he is a brilliant strategist," Evelyn said, walking back to her desk and resting her hands on the leather surface. "He assumes that because you mend old books in a basement, you lack the spine to challenge him in the real world. He mistook your quiet labor for weakness." "My father does not understand preservation," I replied, slipping my phone back into my pocket. "He thinks you maintain a structure by slapping fresh paint over rotting wood. He forgot that the person who handles the foundation knows exactly where the weak points are." "What is your next step, Genevieve?" "I am going to return to the estate," I said. "My parents assume I am sleeping on a friend's couch, nursing a bruised ego over a cancelled rent check. They expect me to stay quiet to protect the family peace. I am going to let them look at the ledger." Evelyn nodded, her expression hardening into a look of absolute approval. "Sloane's wedding is a transaction, Genevieve. It always was. Your family expects the Bradford accounts to absorb their liabilities once the marriage certificate is signed. They are relying on my son's infatuation to blind him to their financial reality. They do not realize that the Bradford accounts are managed by me." She picked up the manila folder and locked it inside her bottom desk drawer. "Do not let them intimidate you," Evelyn instructed. "They operate on the assumption that you fear losing your place in their society. Show them that you no longer desire a seat at their table." "I do not want their table," I said, standing up from the leather chair. "I am just coming to collect the bill." I walked out of the corporate headquarters and took the elevator down to the lobby. The afternoon sun had burned off the coastal fog, leaving the Boston streets bright and sharp. I did not return to the Historical Society. I walked to the transit station and boarded a commuter train heading north toward the suburbs. I was going back to the colonial house with the slipping slate roof. I was going to walk into the immaculate kitchen with the imported granite countertops, and I was going to present my parents with the true cost of their illusions. They thought they had buried my future in a general family trust. They were about to find out that a conservator always knows how to pull the truth out of the archives. The commuter train ride back to the suburbs provided the quiet space I needed to sequence my thoughts. As the train rattled along the coastal tracks, I did not feel the crushing weight of heartbreak. I felt the cold, sharp focus of an archivist preparing to catalog a deeply flawed collection. By the time I walked up the long gravel driveway of the Alden estate, the late afternoon sun was casting long, condemning shadows across the slipping slate roof. The house looked different to me now. It was no longer a childhood home. It was a crime scene hiding behind manicured hedges. I unlocked the heavy front door, using the key I had not yet surrendered. The foyer was silent, smelling of expensive wax and stale air. I walked directly to the formal study at the back of the house. I found my parents exactly where I expected them to be. Richard sat behind his heavy oak desk, reviewing a stack of printed emails with a gold fountain pen in his hand. Victoria rested on the velvet sofa near the window, a cup of Earl Grey tea untouched on the porcelain saucer beside her. They looked like a curated exhibit of generational stability, a perfect diorama of old money leisure. Victoria looked up, her posture immediately stiffening. She expected an apology. She expected the prodigal daughter broken by one night on a borrowed couch returning to beg for her old bedroom. "Genevieve," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace with a delicate, practiced motion. "I assumed you would realize how foolish your little exit was last night. We are willing to overlook your dramatic behavior provided you reinstate the bank transfer by tomorrow morning." I did not answer her. I walked straight to my father's desk. I took my smartphone from my blazer pocket, unlocked the screen, and laid it flat on the pristine leather blotter. The screen displayed the high-resolution photograph of the foundation routing document. His signature sat clear and undeniable on the bottom line. "Swipe left," I instructed. My voice carried the clinical, unyielding tone of a museum director presenting a forged artifact. Richard frowned, clearly annoyed by the disruption to his afternoon routine. He lowered his reading glasses, letting them rest on the bridge of his nose, and looked down at the glowing screen. He swiped his finger across the glass. He saw the scanned fellowship check issued to the family trust. He swiped again and saw the internal ledger detailing his margin calls and Sloane's European vacation expenses. I watched his face closely. In a normal family, discovering you have been caught stealing a six-figure grant from your own child would trigger panic, shame, or at least a frantic, desperate denial. Richard Alden displayed none of these emotions. He simply sighed, pushing the phone back across the desk toward me as if I had handed him a disappointing restaurant menu. "You always were overly dramatic about paperwork," my father said. He removed his glasses entirely and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I handled the fellowship internally. It was a necessary reallocation of resources for the betterment of this household." "You forged a rejection letter," I stated, keeping my posture rigid. "You intercepted a federal grant awarded to my name. You diverted $150,000 into a trust you control, and you used it to pay your brokerage debts." Victoria stood up from the velvet sofa, smoothing the wrinkles from her wool skirt. She walked over to stand beside my father, forming a united front. They were closing ranks. "We protected this family," Victoria corrected. Her tone adopted the patient, condescending rhythm of a teacher addressing a remarkably slow student. "Your father made a brilliant strategic decision. We were facing a severe cash flow issue. You were living under our roof, eating our food and utilizing our amenities. That grant money belonged to the Alden name, and we deployed it where the Alden name needed it most." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let us be practical, Genevieve. What were you actually going to do with that fellowship? You mend old paper in a basement. You hide from society. You do not need prestige. You have chosen a life of quiet obscurity." He gestured toward the window, pointing in the general direction of the city. Sloane, on the other hand, needed social capital. The Bradford merger required a significant upfront investment. Sloane had to be seen in the right European circles, staying in the right hotels, to secure Preston's interest. "We secured your sister's future, which in turn secures our own. You should be thanking us for having the foresight you so clearly lack." I stood in front of the desk, absorbing the breathtaking scale of their delusion. They truly believed their own narrative. They had twisted an act of federal fraud into an act of parental martyrdom. They were attempting to gaslight me into believing that my ruined career was a noble sacrifice. They weaponized the concept of loyalty, wielding it like a tool to force me into compliance. You are acting incredibly selfish, Victoria added, her eyes narrowing as she studied my unresponsive face. A true daughter understands that individual desires must sometimes yield to the greater good. We expected you to play your part. We kept you safe here, and in return, you contribute to the foundation of this family. Stealing. That is a very ugly word for a beautiful sacrifice. We did this out of love, Genevieve. Love requires hard choices. I prepared to ask how a luxury vacation in Rome equated to a hard choice. I prepared to point out that true love does not require a forged signature. But before I could speak, Richard shifted in his chair. He raised his left wrist and checked his watch. He tapped the glass face with his index finger, his eyes darting toward the hallway. He was treating the exposure of his theft as an annoying meeting that was running over time. He was bored by my ruined future. He was irritated that my confrontation was delaying his evening scotch. That tiny dismissive gesture accomplished what years of verbal belittlement could not. It severed the final invisible string tying me to their approval. In archival conservation, we look for microscopic signs of structural failure. A tiny crack in the binding often indicates the entire spine is about to shatter. My father checking his watch was the definitive sign of a failed structure. I realized in that exact moment that they were entirely hollow. There was no core of parental affection buried beneath their snobbery. There was only a ledger, and my column was meant to be drained until I had nothing left to give. Arguing with them was like arguing with dry rot. You cannot convince decay to repair itself. You can only cut it out and remove the artifact from the corrosive environment. I reached across the leather blotter and picked up my phone. I slid it back into my blazer pocket. I am not here to argue about the legal definition of theft, I said softly. I just wanted to see if either of you felt even a fraction of remorse. Remorse for saving this family, Richard scoffed, turning his attention back to the printed emails on his desk. Grow up, Genevieve. The world operates on leverage, not sentiment. You are correct, I replied, my voice steady and cold. The world operates on leverage. I turned around and walked toward the door of the study. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten them with police involvement. I did not promise to call the foundation board to report the fraud. I offered them no insight into my next move. That silence was a tactical choice. When you threaten someone, you give them a timeline and a specific target to defend against. When you promise nothing, you leave them in the dark, forced to imagine every possible consequence. Victoria took a quick step forward, her confident facade slipping just a fraction as my hand closed around the brass doorknob. Where are you going, Genevieve? We are not finished discussing this matter. You will not walk out of here and ruin your sister's wedding with your selfish tantrums. I paused in the doorway. I looked back at the woman who had charged her expensive luncheons to my stolen career, and the man who could not be bothered to look up from his desk. We are finished, I said. Enjoy your evening. I walked out of the study and exited the house, leaving them in the heavy, suffocating silence of their own making. The lack of a threat terrified them more than any screaming match ever could. I knew they would spend the night pacing the hardwood floors, wondering what I was going to do with the digital evidence resting in my pocket. I also knew they would not wait for me to strike first. A cornered animal always attempts to bite, and my family was about to prove just how far they would go when their survival was on the line. The morning after I left my parents standing in their study, I returned to the Historical Society. I craved the predictable, unyielding environment of the basement lab. The low hum of the climate control system offered a steady rhythm that helped quiet the noise in my head. I sat at my stainless steel bench working on a brittle land grant from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The document was suffering from severe iron gall ink corrosion. The acidic ink was literally burning through the parchment, eating the history from the inside out. Stopping the decay required a localized application of a calcium phytate solution to bind the corrosive iron ions, followed by a mild alkaline wash to neutralize the acid. You have to treat the root of the chemical rot, or the paper will eventually turn to dust. I knew my father and mother were not going to surrender to my departure. They were going to retaliate. I anticipated an angry phone call. I anticipated a legal threat regarding the property taxes. I did not anticipate Sloan. At 10 o'clock, the internal phone on my lab wall chimed. It was the administrative assistant for Dr. Marcus Linwood, the director of the Historical Society. Marcus is a veteran historian, a man who values empirical evidence over social pedigree and loud philanthropy. He requested my presence in his upstairs office immediately. I cleaned my tools, placed the fragile land grant in a secure folder, and took the elevator to the administrative floor. The upper levels of the society are bathed in natural light, featuring plush carpets, oil portraits of wealthy donors, and panoramic views of the Boston skyline. It is a world built for board members and wealthy patrons, a world very similar to the one my family inhabited, far removed from the chemical solvents and bone folders of my daily reality. Marcus sat behind his heavy mahogany desk. His expression was unreadable. He did not offer his usual warm greeting or ask about the progress of the colonial documents. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him. I sat down, keeping my posture straight and my hands folded in my lap. Marcus opened a manila folder and extracted a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. It bore the embossed, expensive monogram of the Newbury Point Gallery where my sister worked. He placed the paper flat on the desk and slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. "Your sister scheduled an urgent meeting with me this morning an hour before the building opened to the public," Marcus said. His voice was even devoid of direct accusation, but heavy with professional gravity. She arrived in a state of high agitation. She presented this formal written complaint and demanded immediate disciplinary action. I looked down at the letter. The typeface was elegant, the margins perfectly aligned. The contents were catastrophic. Sloan had drafted a detailed, formalized accusation, claiming she possessed credible evidence that I was utilizing my position as an archival conservator to steal rare, uncatalogued pages from the Society's secure collections. The letter alleged, I was smuggling individual leaves of 17th-century maritime logs out of the basement and selling them to anonymous private collectors on the black market to fund a secret lifestyle. Sloan claimed she was coming forward out of a heavy sense of civic duty, stating she could not allow her own sister to desecrate the history of Boston. The letter concluded with a demand for my immediate termination and a strong recommendation that the society involve local law enforcement. I read the words twice, ensuring my eyes were not betraying me. My family had escalated the conflict far beyond financial extraction. They were actively attempting to destroy my professional reputation, strip me of my livelihood, and send me to federal prison. The strategy was terrifying in its precise cruelty. Richard and Victoria knew I possessed the photographic evidence of their grant fraud. They knew I could expose the stolen fellowship to Evelyn Bradford or the foundation board at any moment. To neutralize that threat, they sent Sloan to strike first. If I was publicly fired and investigated for black market theft, my credibility would evaporate instantly. If I subsequently attempted to report my father for embezzling my grant, the authorities and the board of directors would view my claims as the desperate retaliatory lies of a disgruntled criminal employee. My family was building a preemptive cage around my voice. They were willing to manufacture a felony to protect their stolen luxury. I kept my hands still. I did not touch the forged complaint. I looked up at Marcus. "Are you calling the police?" I asked, maintaining the calm clinical register I use when handling a compromised, highly flammable artifact. Marcus studied my face for a long moment. The silence stretched across the sunlit office. He reached across the desk, picked up the cream-colored letter, and dropped it into the small recycling bin resting near his feet. The heavy paper landed with a quiet, hollow thud. "I have overseen this institution for 2 decades, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "I know how a thief operates. A thief rushes their work. A thief leaves sloppy margins and uneven binding because they do not respect the material. They only respect the payout." He gestured toward the floor, pointing in the direction of my basement lab. "You spent 3 weeks last month meticulously rehydrating a single page of a merchant diary that holds almost zero financial value on the open market. You logged every chemical solvent you used, You documented every microscopic tear. You stayed here until midnight on a Friday to ensure the drying press applied the exact right amount of pressure. You work with a level of reverence that cannot be faked. A tight, rigid knot in my chest one I had not realized I was holding slowly began to loosen. Your sister is a very polished woman. Marcus continued, his tone shifting from professional detachment to deep observation. But she made a critical error in her presentation this morning. She assumes that everyone in this city values optics over substance. She walked into my office wearing a coat that costs more than your annual salary, claiming you were the one funding a lavish lifestyle. She accused you of stealing uncatalogued pages, failing to realize that you personally designed the secure digital cataloging system we use to track those exact pages. She does not understand preservation, Genevieve. She only understands extraction. I looked at the recycling bin where my sister's lie now rested. Why would she do this? Marcus asked, his voice softening with genuine concern. A sibling does not try to initiate a federal investigation out of thin air. What did you find, Genevieve? I considered telling him everything. I considered explaining the stolen fellowship, the diverted rent money, the fake rejection letter, and the massive illusion my parents were desperately trying to uphold to secure the Bradford wealth. But involving Marcus meant exposing the historical society to the messy, vindictive fallout of the Alden estate. My family had already tried to weaponize my workplace. I would not let them taint the only sanctuary I had left. I found a severe discrepancy in a family ledger, I said carefully. I removed my compliance and they are attempting to revoke my credibility before I can correct the record. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the boundary I had drawn. He understood that some historical conflicts must be resolved by the people who inherited them. I will not officially log that complaint, Marcus stated, returning to his authoritative posture. As far as this institution is concerned, the meeting with your sister never occurred. However, you need to understand the severity of the forces you are dealing with. A family willing to draft a document like that will not stop at a single failed attempt. They will find another venue. They will find another authority figure who does not know your character as well as I do. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany desk. You have built a fortress of respect in this building through your quiet competence. Your work speaks for itself. But outside these walls, a loud lie often outruns a quiet truth. You need to prepare yourself. If they are willing to manufacture a crime, you must ensure your defense is impenetrable. I understand, I replied, standing up from the leather chair. Do not let them dictate the narrative, Marcus added, his eyes fierce with a protective mentor's resolve. Preserve your own history. I left the administrative suite and took the elevator back down to the basement. The door slid open, welcoming me back into the cool, filtered air of the conservation lab. I walked to my stainless steel bench and looked at the delicate tools arranged in perfect order. The scalpels, the bone folders, the soft brushes. My family had declared war. They had escalated from financial theft to character assassination, proving they possessed no moral floor. They expected me to cower in fear of their social influence. They expected the threat of a ruined reputation to force me back into submission. They failed to realize that an archivist spends her entire life learning how to authenticate the truth. I knew how to analyze ink. I knew how to verify a signature. I knew how to trace a document back to its exact point of origin. Sloane had handed me a warning, but she had also handed me a timeline. I had to assemble my own arsenal before they returned with a stronger attack. I needed to pull every piece of evidence, every forged signature, and every misdirected fund into a flawless, undeniable dossier. I was going to secure the truth so tightly that no amount of old money influence could ever tear it apart. I woke up the next morning on the borrowed sofa in Somerville and knew I could not go into the laboratory. I needed a personal day, but I was not taking it to rest. I was taking it to assemble an arsenal. My family had spent their entire lives controlling the narrative, relying on the polite silence of the people they stepped on. They assumed my silence indicated surrender. They did not realize that an archivist only stays quiet so she can hear the exact moment a structure begins to crack. I called Marcus at the Historical Society before business hours. I requested 24 hours of personal leave and asked him for a single favor. I needed a high-resolution photocopy of the formal complaint my sister had submitted. He did not ask for a justification. He simply told me the document would be waiting in a sealed envelope at the front reception desk. I retrieved the envelope an hour later, bypassing the basement lab entirely. My next destination was the Alden Cabot Preservation Foundation headquarters in the Back Bay neighborhood. The foundation occupied a restored brownstone, projecting the same quiet, intimidating wealth my father frequently weaponized. I did not wear my usual work attire. I wore a tailored wool suit dressing for the environment I intended to dismantle. I walked into the reception area and requested an immediate meeting with the grants administrator. The receptionist attempted to dismiss me, citing a lack of an appointment. I placed my driver license on the mahogany counter and stated my full name, adding that I was the primary recipient of last year's Maritime Conservation Fellowship and required urgent documentation for a federal tax audit. The phrase federal tax audit acts as a universal key in bureaucratic environments. The receptionist picked up the phone without another word. 10 minutes later, I sat in a brightly lit office across from a mid-level administrator named Helen. She typed my name into her secure database. I watched her screen reflect in her eyeglasses. She confirmed that a fellowship had been awarded to Genevieve Alden in November of the previous year. I asked Helen to print the original award letter and the subsequent disbursement records. She hesitated, noting that the funds had been routed to a family trust authorized by a board member. I kept my voice entirely pleasant and unyielding. I reminded her that as the named recipient of the grant, I possessed a legal right to my own financial records regardless of where the board directed the capital. Helen printed the documents. I reviewed the fresh ink on the crisp white paper. The award letter was flawless, completely contradicting the polite rejection my father had handed me in our kitchen. The disbursement record clearly showed the routing instructions redirecting $150,000 into the trust my father controlled. I slid the papers back across the desk and asked Helen to notarize them. I needed a legally binding authentication that these were exact, unaltered copies provided directly by the foundation. Helen retrieved her official stamp, pressed it firmly against the bottom of each page, and signed her name. The raised seal of the notary embosser left a permanent, undeniable texture on the paper. My father could argue against a photograph, but he could not argue against a notarized institutional record. I thanked Helen, placed the documents in a rigid portfolio, and left the brownstone. My next stop was a specialized print shop in Cambridge. I connected my smartphone to their high-definition photo printer and processed the images I had taken in Evelyn Bradford's office. I printed the scanned image of the stolen check, focusing specifically on the endorsement line. I requested the prints on archival quality matte paper to ensure maximum clarity of the ink strokes. I returned to Maya's apartment in the early afternoon. The cramped living room was empty. I cleared the small wooden dining table and transformed it into a forensic workspace. I unpacked my portable conservation kit, arranging my illuminated magnifying loupe, a precise millimeter ruler, and a specialized synthetic light pad. I placed the notarized award letter on the left side of the table. In the center, I positioned the high-resolution photograph of the stolen fellowship check. On the right, I laid out the photocopy of Sloane's fabricated complaint from the Historical Society. I turned on the light pad and placed the photograph of the check endorsement over the illumination. The signature read, Genevieve Alden. For a year, I assumed my father had simply forged my name to clear the deposit. But as I adjusted the magnification of my loupe, studying the structure of the ink, I recognized a completely different mechanical rhythm. Handwriting is a physical habit. My father writes with a heavy, deliberate pressure, using a broad nib fountain pen, creating thick downward strokes and abrupt stops. The signature on the back of the stolen check was different. The letters were sharp, slanted aggressively to the right, with a distinct looping curvature on the letter E. The ink was a standard ballpoint application, applied with a swift, impatient energy. I shifted the loupe over to the formal complaint Sloane had delivered to Marcus. I focused on her signature at the bottom of the page, Sloane Alden. I moved the ruler between the two documents, measuring the angle of the slant and the specific geometric proportions of the capital A in our shared last name. The baseline was identical. The hesitation mark at the start of the upward stroke was a perfect match. The aggressive loop on the final letter mirrored the forged endorsement precisely. My father had not forged my signature to steal the fellowship. Sloane had done it. Richard had orchestrated the financial diversion, but Sloane had executed the federal fraud. She had endorsed a check issued in my name to fund her European vacation and secure her billionaire fiancé. She had committed a felony, and then she had marched into my workplace to accuse me of being a criminal. I sat back in the wooden chair, turning off the illuminated magnifier. A profound sense of calm washed over me. I was no longer a victim reacting to a chaotic, abusive environment. I was the architect of their ruin. They had handed me the exact tools required to dismantle their lives, neatly packaged in their own arrogance. They believed I was too passive to investigate the mechanics of their theft. They failed to realize that investigation was my singular profession. I reached into my bag and withdrew a specialized acid-free archival folder. It is the type of enclosure we use at the Historical Society to protect irreplaceable artifacts from environmental degradation. The material is chemically inert, designed to preserve the contents for centuries without allowing any external corruption to penetrate the surface. I picked up the notarized Foundation Award letter. I placed it gently into the folder. I picked up the high-resolution photograph of Sloane's forged endorsement and laid it on top. Finally, I added the formal fabricated complaint she had submitted to my director. I closed the cover of the folder and tied the string closure in a tight, methodical knot. I was preserving the truth of my family's betrayal the exact same way I preserved the history of Boston. I secured the evidence in a neutral environment where it could never be altered, denied, or overwritten by their loud, frantic lies. The ledger was complete. Every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every malicious accusation was now authenticated and ready for presentation. I placed the archival folder into my bag and looked out the small window of the apartment. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the brick buildings of Somerville. My parents and my sister were currently navigating their day, attending luncheons, and planning a lavish rehearsal dinner, entirely unaware that the foundation of their reality was already resting inside a cardboard enclosure on my dining table. I did not need to scream or issue empty threats. I only needed to wait for the perfect moment to open the folder. Based on the escalating desperation of their recent actions, I knew that moment was approaching rapidly. I arrived at the Historical Society the following morning, carrying my canvas tote bag. The archival folder rested securely inside, leaning against my laptop. I swiped my security badge and entered the climate-controlled vault of the basement laboratory. The air smelled of aged leather, ethanol, and binding glue. It was a familiar grounding comfort. I placed my bag inside a locked metal storage cabinet, twisted the combination dial, and walked over to my stainless steel workbench. I needed a task requiring meticulous focus to keep my mind anchored. I pulled a large 19th-century architectural blueprint from the flat files. It was a schematic for an industrial textile mill rendered in blue cyanotype. The paper was brittle, and decades of improper storage had allowed a fine layer of industrial soot to settle deep into the paper fibers. You cannot wash a blueprint with water, as the image will bleed and blur. You must remove the dirt mechanically using a vulcanized rubber sponge to gently lift the debris without disturbing the surface tension. I picked up the sponge and began working in slow, overlapping circles. The repetitive motion usually brings me a deep sense of peace. Today, the quiet was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my smartphone resting on the edge of the metal bench. I glanced at the screen. I had 4 missed calls from Sloane and 3 from my mother. I did not answer any of them. I continued moving the sponge across the blue paper, watching the original white lines of the architectural drawing slowly reveal themselves beneath the grime. The phone buzzed again, followed by the distinctive chime of a new voicemail notification. I set my tool down. I tapped the screen, pressed the speaker icon, and let the audio fill the sterile, quiet space of the laboratory. Sloane spoke fast. The haughty, melodic rhythm she spent years cultivating at the Newbury Point Gallery had vanished. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. Her voice cracked on the second syllable of my name. "Genevieve, pick up the phone. You need to call me back right now. I do not know what you said to Evelyn, but you need to fix it. She is not returning Mom's emails. The event coordinator at the public library just called to tell us the secondary catering deposit was flagged. The Bradfords put a hold on the wedding accounts. Call me. Her frantic, panicked breathing echoed off the concrete walls and the rows of ancient reference books lining my workspace. I listened to the message a second time. Sloane never asked for assistance. She issued commands. But this command rang hollow. It lacked the weight of actual authority. In our specific Boston social circle, planning a high society wedding operates much like a hostile corporate takeover. Victoria and Sloane approach vendor meetings with the ruthless precision of generals surveying a battlefield. They are accustomed to event planners, bowing to the Alden name, assuming that the incoming Bradford wealth guarantees every extravagant invoice will be paid. My mother had been charging floral arrangements, string quartets, and imported French champagne to a high-interest credit line. She operated under the firm belief that Evelyn Bradford would simply authorize a wire transfer to reimburse the family trust weeks before the rehearsal dinner. Evelyn Bradford did not write checks for liabilities. She had audited my parents, found their structural integrity lacking, and quietly severed the financial cord. Evelyn did not yell or issue a dramatic public denunciation. She simply instructed her corporate accounting department to pause the outgoing transactions. In the realm of old money, silence is a lethal weapon. A paused check acts as a death sentence for social climbers. The caterers, the florists, the venue coordinators, they all communicate within a very tight, enclosed network. The moment a Bradford account flags a transaction, the entire coastal elite ecosystem takes notice. The Alden facade was suffocating, suddenly deprived of the oxygen Evelyn had previously supplied. I turned off the phone screen and picked up my vulcanized sponge. The dust lifted easily from the blueprint. My parents were intelligent enough to track a timeline. Evelyn Bradford toured the Historical Society, summoned me to her corporate headquarters, and immediately froze the wedding funds. Richard and Victoria possessed enough deductive reasoning to connect those specific data points. They realized I had not merely walked out of the house to sleep on a friend's couch. I had walked into the Bradford boardroom and dismantled their false narrative. The sudden loss of control terrified my father more than the actual mounting debt. Richard Alden built his consulting firm on the illusion of access and influence. He sold wealthy, desperate parents the promise that he could leverage his connections to secure Ivy League admissions for their mediocre children. If word spread through the country club that he could not even secure his own daughter's wedding funding, his few remaining clients would vanish by Monday morning. The Bradford merger was his final lifeboat. Without it, the estate would face foreclosure, and his carefully curated social standing would disintegrate into dust. By mid-afternoon, the missed calls transitioned into text messages. I kept my phone on the far edge of the workbench, ignoring the frantic flashing light while I concentrated on repairing a torn margin on the blueprint. At 4 o'clock, a single message arrived from my father. Richard rarely texted. He considered digital communication beneath his dignity, preferring to summon people into his mahogany study where he controlled the lighting and the seating arrangement. The text was brief, devoid of warmth or any polite preamble. Genevieve, we are holding an urgent family summit tomorrow evening at 7. Your attendance is not optional. We expect you in the formal dining room. It is time to resolve this matter. I read the words, noting the specific tactical shift in his vocabulary. He did not invite me. He issued a subpoena. The phrase, urgent family summit, was a relic from my childhood, a term he deployed whenever a crisis threatened the family optics. He used it when my grandfather passed away, and the estate required immediate restructuring to avoid taxes. He used it when his consulting firm lost its largest corporate client, and we had to quietly sell the summer cottage on Cape Cod before the neighbors noticed our financial decline. A summit meant the family was bleeding. They needed me. They needed my compliance, my signature on some fabricated document, or my physical presence, to assure Evelyn Bradford that the Alden family remained a unified, respectable institution. They were pivoting back to the daughter they had publicly labeled a failure, desperate to use me as a human shield against the billionaire matriarch who had seen through their lies. They realized they were losing their grip on the narrative. Sloane had failed to get me fired from the historical society, and my father had failed to intimidate me into returning home. Now they were shifting their strategy. They planned to corner me in the formal dining room, leveraging their combined physical presence to overwhelm my defenses. They expected the weight of generational guilt and parental authority to force me back into my designated role as the quiet, obedient asset. I placed the phone back on the metal bench. I did not type a reply. I knew exactly what kind of trap they were setting. I looked across the laboratory at the locked metal cabinet holding my canvas bag. The archival folder rested safely inside. It held the notarized Foundation Award letter and the high-resolution photograph of Sloane's forged check endorsement. I possessed the undeniable proof of a federal crime committed by the Golden Child orchestrated by the patriarch. I stripped off my protective cotton gloves and tossed them onto the workstation. I packed away my cleaning tools and logged my progress in the conservation database. I was ready to attend their summit. I was ready to walk into their arranged room and listen to their demands. My family assumed they were calling a meeting to dictate the terms of my surrender. They had no idea they were actually scheduling the exact moment of their own ruin. I parked my sensible sedan at the edge of the circular driveway, choosing not to pull up to the front steps. The Alden estate looked particularly imposing in the fading twilight, its slate roof casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawn. I walked to the front door carrying only my small leather purse. I left the archival folder containing the forged check and the notarized foundation documents secured in the trunk of my car. I did not need to bring my evidence into their house. I was not attending this summit to present my case. I was attending to let them present theirs. The heavy front door was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer, greeted by the familiar scent of lemon polish and stale privilege. The house was unnervingly quiet. I walked past the grand staircase and entered the formal dining room. My parents sat at the long mahogany table. They had orchestrated the seating arrangement with tactical precision. Richard occupied the head of the table, his posture rigid, dressed in a charcoal suit that signaled business rather than leisure. Victoria sat immediately to his right, her hands folded neatly over a silk scarf. They left one chair pulled out at the opposite end of the vast wooden surface. The physical distance was designed to make me feel isolated, forcing me to speak across a wide expanse of polished wood while they presented a unified elevated front. I walked to the empty chair and sat down. I kept my spine straight and rested my hands on my lap. I did not offer a greeting. I waited for them to initiate the transaction. "We are glad you decided to be reasonable, Genevieve," Richard began. His voice carried the resonant, authoritative cadence he perfected during decades of consulting. "This family has endured enough unnecessary friction over the past few days. It is time to heal the rift and move forward." Victoria offered a tight, brittle smile. "We want to help you transition into your new living arrangement. We understand that moving out so abruptly must have caused a strain on your finances. Family must support family even during disagreements." I looked at my mother. Her attempt at maternal concern was transparent. She was trying to frame a ransom as a charitable donation. Richard reached beside his plate and picked up a single sheet of bright white legal-sized paper. He slid it across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table. The paper whispered against the wood, coming to a halt directly in front of me. "We have drafted an agreement," Richard said, steepling his fingers. "A simple, straightforward arrangement to ensure mutual peace of mind. Review it." I looked down at the document. It was a non-disclosure agreement, typed in a standard soulless serif font. My archival training kicked in automatically. I analyzed the margins, the spacing, the heavy legal jargon designed to intimidate the reader. The text was structured to construct an alternate reality. The first clause required me to sign a sworn statement claiming I had voluntarily forfeited the Alden Cabot Preservation Fellowship due to personal inability to fulfill the grant requirements. The second clause demanded an irrevocable waiver of all financial claims against the General Family Trust. The third and most revealing clause, stipulated a strict non-disparagement policy, specifically forbidding me from initiating any contact verbal or written with Evelyn Bradford Preston Bradford or any representative of Bradford Holdings. In exchange for signing away my legal rights, my stolen career, and my voice, the document offered a single lump sum payment of $20,000. I stared at the number printed on the page. They had stolen $150,000 of my federal grant money to pay for European vacations and country club dues. Now they were offering to hand me a tiny fraction of my own stolen capital to buy my silence. It was the ultimate transactional ultimatum. $20,000. Victoria interjected her tone, suggesting she was bestowing a winning lottery ticket upon a peasant. That is a very generous cushion, Genevieve. It will allow you to secure a long-term lease, perhaps even a down payment on a modest property in a more affordable city. All we ask in return is that you sign the document and commit to protecting the family name. We can put this ugly misunderstanding behind us. I did not touch the paper. I looked up the length of the table, meeting my father's gaze. You are asking me to perjure myself to cover your fraud, I said. My voice was calm, holding the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. You want me to sign a binding contract confirming a reality that does not exist, and you are using $20,000 of my own stolen grant to finance the bribe. Richard's face hardened. The diplomatic consultant vanished, replaced by the cornered patriarch. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. I strongly suggest you lower your tone and pick up a pen, Richard warned the velvet layer, peeling away from his voice. You are laboring under the delusion that you hold leverage in this situation because you had a brief sympathetic conversation with Evelyn Bradford. You do not hold leverage, you hold a basement job grading old paper. He gestured toward the document with a sharp flick of his wrist. The historical preservation world in New England is an exceedingly small circle, Genevieve. The directors of the museums in Boston, Providence, and Portland all rely on the foundations that men like me control. I sit on the boards that dictate their funding. If you refuse to sign that agreement, I will make 3 phone calls tomorrow morning. Victoria nodded, her eyes flashing with a cold, synchronized agreement. 1 phone call to Marcus Linwood. Richard continued, mapping out my professional execution with terrifying clarity. I will inform him that my daughter is suffering from a severe psychological episode, that you are prone to fabricating malicious lies about your own family, and that you pose a liability to his institution. I will ensure you are blacklisted from every archive, library, and museum on the East Coast. You will never work in conservation again. They laid their final card on the table. They were attempting to legally bind me into my own subjugation under the explicit threat of total career annihilation. They believed that because I loved my work, I would sacrifice my dignity to protect it. They thought the fear of losing my livelihood would force me to swallow the theft of my future. You will sign the agreement, Victoria commanded, dropping the pretense of a negotiation. You will cease all contact with the Bradfords. Sloane's wedding will proceed without your interference, and you will take the money and disappear. Richard reached into his breast pocket. He always carried a vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen, a heavy gold-trimmed writing instrument he received as a graduation gift. He used it to sign lucrative consulting contracts and real estate deeds. He did not offer me the Mont Blanc. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic promotional pen. It was a flimsy ballpoint with a generic bank logo printed on the side. He tossed it down the length of the mahogany table. It skittered across the polished wood, coming to a stop next to the printed NDA. That small, calculated gesture spoke louder than his threats. Offering me the cheap disposable plastic pen, while his gold fountain pen remained secured over his heart, was a final micro-insult. It was a physical manifestation of my designated value within their hierarchy. I was the disposable utility expected to sign away my life with the cheapest tool available. I looked at the plastic pen resting on the table. I looked at the legal document demanding my silence. If I were the girl they raised, I would have picked up the pen. I would have felt the familiar crushing weight of their authority, signed my name on the dotted line, and walked away with a fraction of my own worth, grateful they had not destroyed me entirely. But an archivist knows that a document signed under duress carries the lingering stain of coercion. You cannot build a stable future on a fraudulent foundation. I knew something they did not. I knew they were terrified. They would not have drafted an ironclad non-disclosure agreement if they truly held all the power. A king does not ask a peasant to sign a treaty. The NDA was a shield made of paper, and they were hiding behind it because they knew I held the sword. I did not touch the plastic pen. I did not touch the agreement. I stood up from the formal dining chair. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound cutting through the oppressive silence of the room. I smoothed the front of my blazer, maintaining a slow, deliberate rhythm. You assume I am afraid of losing my seat in a world you control. I said, my voice echoing slightly against the high ceilings. I am not afraid of your phone calls, Dad. You cannot blacklist a conservator whose work proves her competence every time a curator opens a vault. You only possess influence over people who value your money more than their own integrity. Richard's jaw tightened. If you walk out that door without signing, you will have nothing. I will have the truth, I replied, turning away from the table. And as you just proved with this contract, the truth is currently trading at a much higher value than the Alden name. I left the unsigned document and the cheap plastic pen resting on the mahogany table. I walked out of the formal dining room, crossed the foyer, and exited the estate into the cool night air. I had allowed them to present their final ultimatum, and I had left it unanswered. The stage was set for the final clash, and I knew exactly where it was going to happen. The heavy cream envelope arrived at Maya's apartment via private courier 3 days after I walked out of the formal dining room. It carried a wax seal and the unmistakable thick cardstock of a desperate final maneuver. Inside was a formal invitation to the rehearsal dinner for Sloane and Preston. The event was scheduled for Friday evening at a historic 5-star hotel overlooking the Boston Public Garden. My family did not mail this out of a sudden surge of sibling affection. They mailed it because they needed a public stage. I understood the psychology of Boston high society. In their world, scandal is avoided at all costs. Public settings dictate compliance. My parents assumed that if they cornered me in a room filled with influential politicians, gallery directors, and the Bradford extended family, I would shrink into my designated role. They believed I would smile, play the supportive sister, and sign the non-disclosure agreement to prevent a scene. They were weaponizing etiquette to enforce my subjugation. I spent Friday afternoon preparing for the event. I did not buy a new gown to compete with Sloane. I pulled a simple tailored black dress from my canvas duffel bag. It was elegant, unbranded, and functional. I paired it with low heels and minimal jewelry. I needed to move smoothly and project flawless stability. My final piece of preparation was the archival folder. I checked the contents one last time. The notarized award letter from the foundation, the high-resolution photograph of Sloane's forged endorsement, and the fabricated complaint submitted to my director all rested perfectly aligned within the acid-free enclosure. I closed the flap, tied the string, and held the folder against my side. The luxury hotel hummed with the quiet, expensive energy of generational wealth. The lobby featured towering marble columns, grand chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the twilight over the park. I walked past the valet stand and navigated toward the private ballroom reserved for the rehearsal dinner. The double doors stood open, spilling the soft light of hundreds of candles onto the carpeted hallway. I stepped into the ballroom and absorbed the environment. It was a masterpiece of floral engineering and culinary excess. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The guest list represented the apex of New England influence. However, beneath the polished veneer, a distinct tension gripped the room. Evelyn Bradford had frozen the wedding accounts, meaning my parents were likely fronting the astronomical cost of this specific dinner on rapidly maxing out credit lines, praying the marriage certificate would clear their debts the next morning. I spotted Evelyn Bradford standing near the main bar. She wore a striking emerald gown, conversing softly with a group of older gentlemen. She noticed my arrival immediately. A faint, almost imperceptible nod passed between us. She knew why I was there. Beside her, Preston Bradford looked slightly tense, his posture stiff as he scanned the room. I did not move toward the bar. I stood near the entrance, allowing the room to register my presence. My simple black dress stood out starkly against the sea of sequins and pastel silk. I held the archival folder close to my hip, a solitary gray rectangle contrasting with the lavish surroundings. It did not take long for my family to notice the flaw in their curated portrait. Sloane saw me first. She wore a custom designer gown that swept the floor, her hair styled in elaborate waves. The color drained from her face for a fraction of a second before her trained gallery smile snapped into place. She whispered something to my mother, who immediately tapped my father on the shoulder. The three of them moved with synchronized predatory grace. They did not rush. Rushing would attract attention. They glided through the crowd, intercepting me before I could reach the main dining area. "Genevieve, darling," Sloane said, hooking her arm through mine with a grip that felt like a vice. "You made it. We are so thrilled. Come with us, we need to show you the seating chart." She steered me away from the crowded ballroom, guiding me toward a small, dimly lit alcove situated just off the main corridor. The alcove housed a collection of antique velvet chairs and a decorative fireplace shielded from the primary gaze of the guests by heavy brocade curtains. Richard and Victoria followed close behind, effectively sealing the exit. Once we crossed the threshold of the alcove, Sloane dropped her grip. My father stepped sideways, blocking the narrow passageway back to the ballroom. My mother stood beside him, her eyes darting nervously toward the gap in the curtains to ensure no one was watching. They had executed their ambush perfectly. I was boxed in, cornered in a private space just inches away from the public eye. Through the gap in the heavy fabric, I could see Evelyn and Preston Bradford looking in our direction from across the room. Evelyn remained perfectly still, watching the trap spring shut. "You are going to fix this tonight," Richard whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced the folded non-disclosure agreement. He flattened it against the marble surface of a small side table and produced his gold fountain pen. "You will sign this document right now, and then you will walk out there, smile at Evelyn, and tell her you had a momentary lapse in judgment." The heavy brocade curtains smelled faintly of dust and old perfume, trapping the heat of our bodies in the narrow alcove. My father's presence loomed large in the confined space. He was accustomed to utilizing his physical stature to intimidate subordinate board members. He leaned over the marble table, his knuckles turning white as he braced his weight against the stone. The ambient noise of the ballroom drifted into the alcove. I heard the delicate, expensive clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft murmur of polite laughter. A string quartet played a bright classical melody in the background. The refined, joyful soundtrack provided a jarring, surreal contrast to the ugly desperation radiating from my father. "Do you hear that music?" Victoria hissed, stepping closer to me. "That is the sound of our survival. The catering bill for this evening alone exceeds $50,000. We are stretched beyond our limits, Genevieve. If Evelyn does not release the holds by tomorrow morning, this entire event collapses. The vendors will walk out. The Bradford family will cancel the ceremony. You will not destroy your sister's life out of petty jealousy." I looked at Sloane. She stood with her arms crossed, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The bride-to-be was unraveling under the weight of her own fraud. "Sign the paper, Genevieve," Sloane demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and entitlement. "You owe me. I have covered for your social awkwardness my entire life. I have played the perfect daughter so you could hide in your basement. You are not going to take this away from me." I looked down at the marble table. The legal document demanded my silence. The gold fountain pen lay next to it, catching the dim light of the alcove. My father had upgraded the writing instrument from the plastic promotional pen he offered at the house. He thought the shiny gold casing would make the surrender more palatable. He misunderstood my values. I did not care about gold casing. I cared about the integrity of the ink. "If you walk out of this alcove without signing your name, I will follow through on every promise I made," Richard threatened, stepping closer to block my path entirely. "I will call the museum directors. I will call the university deans. I will ensure your professional reputation is reduced to ash. You will be blacklisted by Monday. Pick up the pen." The crystal glasses continued to clink in the adjacent room. The string quartet shifted into a new movement. The juxtaposition of their elegant social facade and their ruthless internal extortion crystallized everything I had spent years analyzing. They were willing to sacrifice my career. my financial stability, and my freedom to maintain a catering budget. I did not reach for the gold pen. I held the gray archival folder with both hands. I felt the firm protective edges of the acid-free cardboard beneath my fingertips. The enclosure held the truth perfectly preserved and ready for exhibition. I looked at my father, taking a slow, measured breath, allowing the clinical detachment of a conservator to dictate my next move. My father pushed the gold fountain pen closer to my hand, the polished metal scraping softly against the marble tabletop. He expected me to break. He had spent his entire career in corporate consulting, learning how to corner vulnerable targets, isolating them in high-pressure environments until they conceded. He believed I was just another negotiation, a minor obstacle to be managed before the real celebration could begin. I placed my gray archival folder directly on top of the non-disclosure agreement. The rigid cardboard covered the typewritten lies claiming the space. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. In a crisis, the person who controls the decibel level controls the room. I inhaled the faint scent of old perfume clinging to the heavy brocade curtains and accessed the clinical load-bearing tone I use when stabilizing a crumbling manuscript. "I am not signing your document, Dad," I said, "and I am not leaving." Victoria gasped a short, sharp intake of air. She stepped forward, her silk dress rustling. "Genevieve, you are acting hysterical. Pick up the pen. Do not force your father to make those phone calls. You will ruin your own life just to spite us." "You cannot ruin a foundation that has already been hollowed out," I replied. I untied the string closure on the archival folder, working the knot with steady, deliberate fingers. "You brought a contract to a hostage situation, but you failed to realize that I am not the hostage." I opened the folder. The pristine, acid-free environment had kept the papers crisp and perfectly flat. I pulled out the first document and laid it on the marble table, pushing it toward my father. "This is a notarized copy of the formal award notification from the Alden Cabot Preservation Foundation," I stated, my voice echoing faintly over the ambient noise of the ballroom outside the alcove. "It is dated November 12th of last year. It confirms that the board awarded the fellowship directly to me. It proves the rejection letter you handed me in our kitchen was a fabrication." Richard looked down at the paper. His jaw tightened, but he did not speak. His eyes scanned the raised notary seal at the bottom of the page. He recognized the irrefutable nature of the authentication. He had spent years serving on various philanthropic boards, drafting bylaws and moving endowments. He knew what a bulletproof paper trail looked like. I reached into the folder and produced the second piece of evidence. I placed the high-resolution photograph of the cleared fellowship check next to the award letter. "This is the disbursement record," I continued, maintaining my unhurried rhythm. "It shows a transfer of $150,000 into a general family trust that you control. You utilized an archaic loophole to intercept federal grant money awarded to your daughter. You used it to cover your margin calls and fund a European vacation." Sloane scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. She refused to look at the table. "Dad protected the family assets. You were living rent-free under our roof. We reallocated the funds. It is not our fault you do not understand high-level finance." I turned my gaze to my sister. Sloane possessed a remarkable ability to reshape reality, to fit her comfort, a survival mechanism she developed early in childhood to cope with our parents' impossible standards. She believed her own fiction. I was about to strip that fiction away. "You should look at the photograph, Sloane," I said. "You should look very closely at the endorsement line on the back of the check." Sloane hesitated, her eyes darting between me and our father. She reluctantly uncrossed her arms and leaned over the marble table, squinting at the glossy photograph. "For a year, I assumed Dad forged my signature to clear the deposit," I explained, tracking the exact moment her breathing stopped. "But a signature is a mechanical habit. Dad writes with heavy downward pressure using a broad nib fountain pen. The signature on this check features a sharp rightward slant and a distinct looping curvature on the letter E. It was executed with a standard ballpoint pen. It is an exact geometric match to your signature." Sloane stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the carpet. Her hands flew to her mouth. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. "You endorsed a stolen check issued in my name," I told her, making sure the reality settled deep into her bones. Dad orchestrated the financial diversion, but you executed the fraud. You committed a felony to pay for your flights to Rome. You stole my career to buy a billionaire husband. Richard, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched my father's arm. Richard, what is she talking about? My father remained silent. He stared at the photograph, calculating the damage. He had manipulated Sloane into signing the document to keep his own hands clean, using his golden child as a shield. I reached into the folder for the final time. I pulled out the photocopy of the formal complaint Sloane had delivered to my director. I set it gently on top of the other documents. And this, I said, looking directly at Sloane, is the letter you handed to Marcus Linwood yesterday morning. You tried to frame me for stealing rare artifacts. You demanded my termination and suggested a criminal investigation. You wanted to send me to federal prison to discredit me before I could expose your theft. Tears spilled over Sloane's lower lashes, ruining her careful makeup. She looked at our father for protection, but Richard was staring at the marble table, paralyzed by the collapse of his strategy. I have spent my entire life being your utility, I said, letting my clinical detachment drop just enough to reveal the steel underneath. I mended your broken hinges. I paid your property taxes. I absorbed your insults because you convinced me that intellectual prestige was the only measure of a person, and I had fallen short. You treated my labor as an embarrassment while you secretly fed off the wages it produced. I stepped closer to the table, forcing them to meet my eyes. I will not be your budget anymore, I declared, my voice slicing through the heavy, perfumed air of the alcove. I will not be the scapegoat you sacrifice to maintain your country club memberships. And I will not be the foundation you stand on while you pretend to be royalty. I am officially resigning from the Alden family ledger. Richard's chest heaved. He reached out and grabbed the non-disclosure agreement, thrusting it toward me. If you take those documents out of this alcove, you will destroy your sister. The Bradford family will cancel the wedding. We will lose everything. Sign the paper, Genevieve. We will pay you the $20,000. We will find a way to pay you more. Just sign the contract. I looked at the typed legal document trembling in his hand. I reached out and took the paper from his grasp. I did not look for a pen. I turned the crisp sheet over, examining the dense block of text on the second page. My profession requires me to analyze documents for structural integrity, identifying flaws that threaten the survival of the text. I apply the same scrutiny to modern contracts. You used a generic online template to draft this, I observed, tapping my finger against the severability clause near the bottom margin. You did not consult a real attorney because you could not risk anyone outside this family learning about the stolen grant. In your rush to silence me, you failed to adjust the boilerplate language. The binding jurisdiction is listed as the state of Delaware, but the arbitration clause references California corporate law. Furthermore, the named entity providing the settlement payout is the Alden Cabot General Family Trust. I dropped the paper back onto the marble table. It fluttered down, landing over the cheap plastic pen. You cannot legally bind a person to a non-disclosure agreement using funds stolen from a trust that is currently the subject of federal fraud. I explained, watching my father's eyes widen in horror. The contract is structurally invalid. Your extortion is as sloppy as your parenting. The string quartet in the main ballroom reached a crescendo, the bright notes swelling into the quiet space of our alcove. My mother covered her face with her hands, a quiet, muffled sob escaping her throat. Sloane leaned against the decorative fireplace, staring blankly at the floor, realizing her curated future was evaporating. I picked up my archival folder, leaving their useless contract and the plastic pen behind. I had executed my boundary. I had spoken the truth out loud, refusing to hide their theft any longer. I felt a profound, settling peace. I turned toward the exit of the alcove, ready to walk away from them forever. The heavy brocade curtain shifted. The fabric pulled back with a soft, sliding sound. Evelyn Bradford stepped into the dim light of the alcove. Her emerald gown shimmered faintly. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of total, terrifying composure. She did not look at my parents. She did not look at Sloane. She looked directly at the forged documents scattered across the marble table. She had been standing just outside the curtain. She had heard every word. The heavy brocade curtain settled into place with a soft brushing sound. Evelyn Bradford stood inside the narrow alcove. The ambient light from the main ballroom caught the emerald silk of her gown, but her physical presence was what truly consumed the space. The air in the room seemed to thin. Victoria let out a choked, breathless sound, taking a reflexive step backward until her spine hit the decorative stone fireplace. Richard froze. His hand still hovering near the rejected non-disclosure agreement began a faint, uncontrollable tremor. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not demand an explanation or feign shock. People who build empires do not waste their breath on theatrics. She glided toward the marble table, her gaze tracking over the scattered documents. She looked at the notarized Foundation Award letter, the high-resolution photograph of the forged check endorsement, and the fabricated Historical Society complaint. Richard scrambled to salvage the illusion. He straightened his posture, forcing a hollow, desperate chuckle that echoed awkwardly against the velvet walls. Evelyn, this is merely a private misunderstanding. Genevieve is prone to theatrics. We were just concluding a rather tense discussion regarding a family trust. Evelyn lifted her chin and pinned my father with a look of absolute glacial disdain. Do not insult my intelligence, Richard. A family trust is a vehicle for preserving generational wealth. What you have constructed is a criminal enterprise designed to subsidize your failures. The color drained from Richard's face. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Evelyn turned her attention to Sloane. My sister was trembling, her hands clutching the fabric of her custom designer dress. She attempted to deploy the fragile, victimized persona that had served her so well in the past. Evelyn, please, Sloane begged, her voice cracking. Genevieve is jealous. She fabricated these documents because she wants to ruin my happiness. Preston knows I would never do something like this. The curtain shifted again. Preston Bradford stepped into the dim light of the alcove. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his mother. His cashmere suit looked flawless, but his expression was hardened steel. He looked at Sloane not with anger, but with the chilling, permanent detachment of a man who has just discovered a fundamental defect in a product he was about to purchase. My mother provided me with the forensic audit of your family's accounts this afternoon, Sloane, Preston said. His tone held no affection. I know exactly who paid for your flights to Rome. I know how you afforded the designer luggage you brought to our weekend in Nantucket. You financed your courtship using a federal grant stolen from your own sister. You endorsed the check. Sloane reached out toward him, her manicured fingers trembling in the air. Preston, I can explain. My father told me the money belonged to the estate. I did not know the details. You knew enough to forge a signature, Preston replied, stepping back to avoid her touch. We are finished. Sloane let out a ragged, agonizing sob and collapsed into one of the antique velvet chairs. She buried her face in her hands, the glamorous bride reduced to a sobbing, exposed fraud. Evelyn shifted her gaze to my mother. Victoria stood paralyzed against the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped her silk scarf. For decades, my mother had navigated Boston high society by projecting an image of effortless superiority. She judged her peers on their lineage and their zip codes, believing her own status was untouchable. Victoria, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a register of profound pity, you spent the last 6 months boasting to my social circle about the impeccable pedigree of the Alden name. You demanded the Boston Public Library for a rehearsal venue to ensure your peers understood your elevated standing. You charged a small fortune in floral arrangements to a credit line you cannot afford, expecting my accounts to quietly absorb your liabilities tomorrow morning. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, unable to withstand the scrutiny. The Bradford family does not merge with thieves, Evelyn stated. She delivered the verdict with the calm precision of a judge reading a sentence. We do not align our legacy with a family that cannibalizes its own children to fund a country club membership. I have officially instructed my accounting department to sever all financial ties with this event. I am revoking our funding, our endorsement, and our association with the Alden name. The reality of the statement crashed into the alcove. The Aldens were not merely losing a wealthy son-in-law. They were losing their financial lifeline hours before the largest bills of their lives came due. The caterers, the florists, the venue coordinators, and the luxury hotel management would expect payment by morning. When the Bradford checks failed to clear, the vendors would turn to Richard and Victoria. The resulting debt would force them into immediate catastrophic bankruptcy. Their social standing would evaporate by Monday. The elite circles of New England are notoriously unforgiving to families who bounce checks at their own weddings. "You cannot do this," Richard whispered, his voice stripped of its usual resonance. "We have contracts. The guests are sitting in the dining room right now." "Then I suggest you go out there and inform them that the bride and groom have experienced a sudden change of heart," Evelyn replied. "Or you can tell them the truth about your forged bank endorsements. The choice of how you execute your own ruin is entirely up to you." Evelyn dismissed them from her attention. She turned away from the trembling, broken remnants of my family and looked at me. I stood quietly near the marble table holding my gray archival folder. I had not spoken a single word since Evelyn entered the alcove. I did not need to add to their destruction. The truth had done the work for me. I had draped my simple wool coat over the back of a nearby chair when I first arrived. Evelyn walked over to the chair. She reached down, picked up my coat, and held it out toward me. In the hierarchical world of Boston old money, the matriarch of a billionaire empire does not perform acts of service for anyone. She does not fetch garments or hold doors. Evelyn Bradford picking up my coat was a deliberate, highly calculated gesture. It was a physical manifestation of respect. It signaled to Preston, to my parents, and to anyone who might peer through the curtains that I was the only person in the room she deemed worthy of her time. I stepped forward and accepted the coat. The wool felt heavy and comforting in my hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Bradford," I said. "You have concluded your business here, Genevieve." Evelyn replied, her expression softening into a genuine, respectful nod. "Your preservation work is impeccable." I turned my back on the marble table. I left the typed non-disclosure agreement resting beneath the fake rejection letter, the photograph of the forged check, and the fabricated police complaint. I left my parents staring at the undeniable evidence of their own crimes. I left my sister sobbing into her designer gown. I pushed past the heavy brocade curtain and stepped out of the alcove. The ballroom was still bright and filled with the cheerful, expensive noise of the rehearsal dinner. The string quartet was playing a lively waltz. Waiters continued to circulate with silver trays of champagne, entirely unaware that the event they were servicing had just been financially decapitated. I did not linger to watch the fallout. I did not care how Richard and Victoria intended to explain the sudden departure of the groom and his mother to the room full of influential guests. That was their mess to clean up, and I was no longer their designated janitor. I walked across the patterned carpet, navigating through the crowd of laughing, well-dressed elites. I kept my posture straight and my gaze focused on the exit. The heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby parted for me, welcoming the cool, crisp air of the Boston evening. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, inhaling the scent of the harbor and the exhaust of passing taxis. I walked down the street, my heels clicking a steady, unburdened rhythm against the pavement. My family was trapped inside a luxury hotel surrounded by a mountain of debt and the shattered remains of their social facade, and I was finally walking free. 6 months have passed since the night I walked out of the luxury hotel and left my family standing in the dim light of the private alcove. In Boston, the changing of the seasons brings a predictable shift in the weather, but social climates turn much faster. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, the various event vendors deposited their checks. The Bradford corporate accounts returned them stamped with insufficient authorization. The resulting financial collapse was swift and surgical. The grand wedding at the Boston Public Library was quietly canceled by Tuesday afternoon. My parents did not send out formal announcements to their curated guest list. They simply stopped answering their phones, retreating behind the heavy wooden doors of their slipping colonial estate. I did not take my family to court. I did not need to file a civil lawsuit, hire a litigator, or contact the federal authorities regarding the stolen fellowship. The truth is an efficient mechanism when placed in the correct hands. Evelyn Bradford did not publicize the forged documents, but she did arrange a private, highly confidential meeting with the chairman of the Alden Cabot Preservation Foundation. She showed him the notarized award letter and the high-resolution photograph of the routed check. The foundation board understood the precarious nature of the situation. To protect the esteemed institution from a public embezzlement scandal, They offered my father a choice. Richard stepped down from his legacy board seat the following week, citing sudden health reasons. He surrendered his influence, his prestige, and his access to the endowment funds to avoid a criminal fraud indictment. He now spends his days isolated from the elite circles he sacrificed his dignity to maintain, living in a house he can barely afford to heat. Sloane experienced a similar descent. The Newbury Point Gallery terminated her employment shortly after the Bradford engagement dissolved. Her employer relied heavily on her proximity to immense wealth to secure high-end art sales. Without the Bradford connection, her value to the gallery evaporated overnight. She now works a mid-level retail position at a clothing boutique on Boylston Street. She spends her shifts steaming silk blouses and organizing display tables. Former peers occasionally walk into the store and she averts her eyes, retreating to the stockroom to avoid their pity. Victoria no longer hosts charity luncheons. The country club suspended their membership due to unpaid monthly dues. The Alden facade collapsed, not because I brought a wrecking ball to their estate, but because I simply stopped paying the mortgage on their illusions. They built a house of cards, and I removed my hands from the foundation. I secured my own peace. I am not a chief executive officer. I did not marry into billionaire wealth, and I did not inherit a sudden fortune. I remain an archival conservator, working every day with my hands. 2 months after the cancelled wedding, Evelyn Bradford established a private historical preservation trust. She endowed a brand new state-of-the-art conservation laboratory in the heart of the city, dedicated specifically to the restoration of early American maritime documents. She hired me as the lead director of the facility. I negotiated my own contract. I receive a robust salary that reflects the exact value of my specialized skills. I pay the rent on a bright, spacious apartment in Cambridge using my own wages. My bank account belongs solely to me, and the balance grows quietly every month. The new laboratory occupies the top floor of a renovated brick building near the harbor. It features tall industrial windows equipped with specialized ultraviolet filters, allowing natural sunlight to flood the workspace without damaging the fragile artifacts. For years, my family told me I belonged in a windowless basement hidden away from the world. Now I work in the sky overlooking the water. The climate control system hums a low, steady rhythm. The air smells of clean linen, paper, wheat, starch paste, and fresh binding leather. I have a team of 3 junior archivists working under my supervision. I do not ask them to perform tasks outside their job descriptions. I ensure they receive proper credit for their meticulous restorations. We operate on a foundation of mutual respect, building an environment where invisible labor is recognized, celebrated, and fairly compensated. This afternoon, the laboratory is quiet. The junior staff left an hour ago, leaving me alone in the sunlit room. I am not repairing a decaying manuscript today. I am building a brand new book. I sit at my stainless steel workbench, a large sheet of pristine acid-free cotton paper resting in front of me. I fold the heavy paper into precise uniform sections, creating the individual signatures that will form the text block. I use my antique bone folder, the smooth cattle bone pressing sharp, clean creases into the fresh material. The repetitive motion brings me a deep, grounding sense of clarity. I punch a series of small holes along the spine of the folded signatures using a sharp awl. I thread a long needle with waxed linen thread. I begin the sewing process, pulling the sturdy thread through the puncture points, weaving the separate sections of paper together. It is a slow, methodical task. I draw the thread tight, ensuring the tension is even and the structure is secure. I am not using a hidden whip stitch to conceal damage. I am using a traditional kettle stitch, leaving the durable braided thread exposed along the spine. The binding is visible, strong, and honest. It does not need to hide its construction to be valuable. I intend to bind this book in soft, dark blue goatskin leather. I will press the covers in the heavy iron nipping press overnight to ensure they dry flat and true. Tomorrow morning, I will open the volume and find hundreds of blank, undamaged pages waiting for ink. It is a book for my own history. I will not use it to track debts or record grievances. I will not use it to measure my worth against an impossible shifting standard. I will use it to catalog my own life, logging the days I spend working with my hands in the sunlight. My family spent 26 years trying to convince me that my quiet competence was a failure. They demanded that I erase my own identity to fit inside their curated expensive frame. They believed that love was a transaction, a debt to be collected and leveraged. I learned the hard way that true love does not require you to sacrifice your future to save someone else's pride. It does not hand you a bill for your existence. The most valuable thing a person can preserve is their own dignity. I saved the truth in an archival folder, and in doing so, I saved myself. I am Genevieve Alden, an archival conservator, and my foundation is finally built on solid ground.
We live in a world that often confuses the shine of a polished surface with the strength of a solid foundation. When we examine the story of Genevieve Alden, it is easy to view it merely as a cinematic tale of betrayal where justice is finally served over a mahogany dining table. But if we peel back the dramatic layers and view this narrative through a lens of spiritual grounding, it reveals itself as something much more profound. It is a striking indictment of the illusions that haunt modern society, particularly the American obsession with status and a quiet plea for a return to genuine parenting values. In the relentless pursuit of success, where the prestige of an Ivy League degree and curated optics often take precedence over character, families can easily lose their way. The Aldens are not just an isolated case of villainy. They are a mirror reflecting what happens when the core tenets of family responsibility, wisdom, ethics, and resilience are abandoned. The first lesson this story imparts is about the nature of true wisdom. In a traditional family structure, parents are meant to be guides who help children navigate the difference between what is valuable and what is merely expensive. The Alden family, trapped in the suffocating illusion of vanity and social standing, lost this ability entirely. They became imprisoned by their desperate need to maintain a facade. To them, Genevieve's choice to work with her hands, spending her days stained with chemical solvents to preserve history, was an embarrassment. They valued a flashy title over the honest dignity of skilled labor. True wisdom in parenting requires the ability to see through these hollow expectations. We must teach our children and remind ourselves that quiet, meaningful contributions hold far more weight than empty titles. When parents cling to social standing, they build homes on decaying foundations, forcing their children to subsidize their lies. This brings us to a devastating second lesson: the collapse of morality and unconditional love. A family should be a sanctuary where a child is valued simply for existing. However, in families driven by external validation, love quickly becomes transactional. The Aldens distorted family support into a mechanism for financial and emotional extortion. They stopped seeing Genevieve as a daughter and began viewing her as a utility and asset to be liquidated whenever her sister's curated lifestyle required funding. This commodification of a child is a profound ethical failure. It begs us to examine our own motives. Are we raising independent whole individuals or secretly shaping them into props to validate our own success? Furthermore, true morality within a family is rooted in absolute honesty. A father intercepting his daughter's hard-earned fellowship and a sister forging a signature to fund a luxury vacation highlights a terrifying moral decay. You cannot teach a child fairness and integrity if the home itself operates on deception. To raise emotionally aware children, parents must first possess the courage to be honest themselves, even when the truth is deeply uncomfortable or financially inconvenient. The third pillar we must examine is resilience, the kind of quiet, unshakable strength Genevieve embodied perfectly. Modern culture often tells us that strength is loud, involving screaming matches and public vengeance. Genevieve showed us that true strength is rooted in stillness. She did not retaliate with blind rage. She used her professional detachment, her deeply ingrained work ethic, and undeniable truth to establish an impenetrable boundary. As parents, we are tasked with preparing children for a harsh world. Look at Sloane, the golden child, and see the tragic result of prioritizing optics over character. Sloane was raised to rely on appearance, deceit, and the wealth of others. She lacked the inner resilience to stand on her own 2 feet. Genevieve built her life on the solid rock of her own labor. We must guide our children to cultivate this independence. We must teach them that tolerating exploitation, even from those sharing their blood, is not a sign of loyalty. Teaching a child the emotional awareness to say no to toxic behavior is a vital parental responsibility. Ultimately, the tragedy of the Alden family points back to an uncomfortable truth. The decay of a family begins when parents forget to examine and repair their own inner lives. The modern world moves at a dizzying speed. It is easy to be swept away by greed, by the anger that arises when children do not conform, and by the delusion that worth is tied to a zip code. When parents are driven by unhealed wounds and insecurities, they pass that poison to the next generation. A home driven by ego ceases to be a nurturing nest and becomes a cage. Before guiding our children toward a life of meaning, we must have the courage to look at the flaws in our own souls. We must abandon relentless social comparisons and focus on cultivating morality, wisdom, and resilience. Only a parent who has done the hard work of healing themselves can provide the steady, unconditional guidance a child truly needs. Only then can we raise a generation equipped to face the world with open eyes and a full heart. Stories like this are not just entertainment. They are a gentle knock on the door of our conscience. They ask us to evaluate the foundations upon which we build our lives. Are we prioritizing the polished granite surface or tending to the structural integrity beneath? If this reflection resonated with you, if you find value in looking past the surface to uncover deeper truths about human relationships, please subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We are building a community dedicated to these quiet, powerful stories of reclamation and self-discovery, and we would be honored to have you walk this path with us. As you go about your day, take a moment to look closely at the life you are constructing. Think about the boundaries you have drawn, the values you are passing down, and the quiet labor you perform in the shadows. When the heavy curtains of societal expectations are finally pulled back and the audience has gone home, what will be left resting on the table? Perhaps the answer is already waiting there, silently asking if the reflection you see is the one you truly want to leave behind.